After the end of World War II, the world was split into two, East and West. This marked the beginning of the era called the Cold War.
In recognizing a communist, physical appearance counts for nothing. If he openly declares himself to be a communist, we take his word for it. If a person consistently reads and advocates the views expressed in a communist publication, he may be a communist. If a person supports organizations which reflect communist teachings, or organizations labeled communist by the Department of Justice, she may be a communist. If a person defends the activities of communist nations while consistently attacking the domestic and foreign policy of the United States, she may be a communist. If a person does all these things over a period of time, he must be a communist.
To talk to you about a matter of vital importance to our country and the world, the struggle for a free Afghanistan. It's been 6 years since the Soviet Union invaded that nation. 6 years of utter hell for the Afghan people who still fight on in the name of the ideals upon which our own nation was founded, freedom and independence. To demoralize and defeat the Afghans, the Soviets have unleashed the full force of their modern weaponry. Poison gas has been raised down from the air upon Afghan settlements. Massive attack helicopters have been used against mere villages. Hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians have been injured or killed, and countless tiny mines have been strewn across the countryside to maim and blind Afghan children.
Defect GI. It is a very good idea to leave a sinking ship. They lie to you, GI. You know you cannot win this war. Rich leaders grow richer while you die in the swamp, GI. They will give you a medal, GI, but only after you are dead. Imperialists make you fight this war, GI. They do not care about you.
Hey there, Steve Harper here again. Now, this is part 2 of the Cold War Conflict Iceberg. So see part 1 if you haven't, by the way, because you really need to see part 1 actually. I'm being serious. Go stop watching this video. Go watch part 1, by the way. So this time I'll be covering the last tiers in this iceberg, hopefully. And these tiers are like people's wars that many people don't really know about, and most of them are like really unknown to many people who know about the Cold War. So this here will be the last part of the iceberg, hopefully. But first, I'm gonna give a little quick recap of the colored legends instead of like doing all the other countries again, because that's in part 1. So this time I'm gonna do the colored legends, and then we get onto the conflicts. So dark blue is for countries that are part of the Western Bloc or allied with them. Light red is for countries that are part of the Eastern Bloc or allied with them. Gray is for non-aligned countries, meaning that they're neutral to the Cold War. Purple is for interbloc conflicts, meaning wars within two countries part of the same bloc. Pink meaning it's, well, a stalemate, meaning both sides saying that they had won, but naturally they didn't really won, and it pretty much ended in a ceasefire. Dark red is for Eastern Bloc victories, light blue is for Western Bloc victories, and cyan is for a ceasefire, meaning nobody really won and it ended on peace agreements. And yellow is for internal reasons, either a coup or a civil war or a revolution. And DC means direct confrontation, meaning a direct confrontation with the nation in the war. PC is for proxy war, meaning both sides have support a supporting side, meaning it's two superpowers in a smaller conflict, people supporting both sides for their own gain and influence. And settlement meaning reasons for either territory dispute or colonization. Also, viewer discussion is advised once again. So sit back, get some snacks and your friends if you have any, and let's get started. First Indochina War. The First Indochina War was a war fought between France and the Vietnamese Democratic Republic of Vietnam and their respective allies from 1946 until 1945, when Viet Minh was led by Vo Nguyen Giap and Ho Chi Minh, if I said it right, and most of the fighting had took place in Tonkin and northern Vietnam, and the conflict had pretty much engulfed the entire country of Vietnam alongside extending into neighboring French Indochina territories of Laos and Cambodia. Now, in World War II, Japan had pretty much like occupied many places in Indochina, mainly in Vietnam. And when Japan had pretty much surrendered in 1945, France had used to own Indochina. But since France had pretty much surrendered in World War II and was now part of the Vichy France like puppet state by the Axis, France soon came back to Indochina, trying to restore its colonial rule in French Indochina. Soon French would soon return to Indochina, and soon guerrilla warfare would soon have started immediately. And French had tried to stabilize Indochina and reorganize it as a federation of associated states in 1949, and as they put former Emperor Bao Dai back in power as ruler of the newly established state of Vietnam. In the first few years of the war had involved ruler essentially against the French, as the Viet Minh had also used his tactics throughout the Vietnam War later on and throughout World War II against Japan. And soon during the 1950s, the conflict was soon turn into a higher bloody war where many both sides had started getting many modern weapons. As French was being supplied by the United States and Viet Minh was being supplied by the Soviet Union and China as well. And the United States didn't really want to support this war because they were doing other stuff as in Korea. So French had used many soldiers from its many colonial troops and empire from places in North Africa, Laotian, and Cambodian, and Vietnamese ethnic minorities, sub-Saharan Africans, and many French troops and European volunteers and units of the Foreign Legion to even fight in this war. And many French leftists in France did not really support this war, as they had called it the Dirty War, as it was starting to become very unpopular back at home. And France's strategy of including the Viet Minh to attack defense bases in more areas at the end of their logistical trails has succeeded at the Battle of Nha San, as French efforts were hampered by the limited usefulness of tanks and forest terrain. As why would you even use tanks and forest terrain? And the lack of a strong air force, and relies on soldiers from many French colonies. While the Viet Minh had pretty much used many artillery attacks, convoy ambushes, and many anti-attack aircraft weaponry to impede land and air with supplies. As the majority of them had learned guerrilla warfare from many instructions from Mao's China and had used many war material provided by the Soviet Union, many anti-air, anti-tanks weaponry, which had pretty much weakened France throughout this whole war. At the Battle of Dan Pan Pu, which took place in 1945, Viet Minh forces had defeated French forces, which soon would even cause for a surrender. As soon France would soon leave Indochina, as it would soon be split up into Laos and Cambodia in North Vietnam and South Vietnam, as Vietnam would soon be divided in its 17th period. But this will soon lead to many conflicts and will even lead to the Vietnam War, which happened years later, as one side was communist and the other side was non-communist. And this war will be very bloody because it's estimated around 400,000 to over 800,000 soldiers had died during this war, as well as the deaths of over 400,000 civilians. And both sides had committed many war crimes, such as the killing civilians, torture, and the Mai Chach massacre, which was a mass murder and wartime committed by many French soldiers against Vietnamese civilians. Berlin blockade. This year was one of the first major international crises during the Cold War, and was one of the reasons why the Cold War even had pretty much started and had went on. As during the multinational occupation of post-World War II Germany, the Soviet Union had blocked the Western Allies' railways and roads access to sectors of Berlin under Western control. And the Soviet offered to drop the blockade if Western Allies withdrew from the newly introduced Deutsche Mark from West Berlin. Now, throughout after World War II, Berlin would soon be divided by France, America, and Britain, who controlled the west side, while the Soviet Union had controlled majority of Berlin, which was the east side. But Berlin was located in East Germany, which is controlled by the Soviet Union. It pretty much started a currency crisis, as the United States and Britain and France had announced on the 21st of June that the Deutsche Mark would be introduced. But the Soviet Union did not want to use this money as legal tender in Berlin. And the Allies had even transported over 205 million Deutsche Marks into the city. And it soon became a standard currency for all sectors. And since the Soviet Union didn't want that currency in their controlled region, they had soon decided to block off many parts of Berlin. as any military supply trains to Berlin were either sent back to Western Germany. And Soviet announced that they introduced the East German mark in their zone, which America did not want. And with this blockade even happening, many people have started to starve, mainly children. So many Western allies, such as United States, United Kingdom, France, Canada, New Zealand, and South Africa, have all agreed to commit an airlift over Berlin. As from June 26, 1948 to the 30th of September 1949, there will be supplies that be flown in from the west into Berlin, as more than 250 times, dropping necessities such as fuel and fuel. And the Soviet Union had pretty much thought the airlift could not work, but it actually did work, and this had caused a massive embarrassment on the Soviet Union. And they had lifted the blockade right after this due to many economic issues in East Berlin, although for the time Americans and British had continued to supply the city by air. The United States Air Force had delivered around over 1 million tons. The Royal Air Force had delivered over 500,000 tons, totaling up to over 200 million tons of supplies. And even though this wasn't really a conflict, but still had part of the Cold War, there was deaths, as around 17 American and 8 British aircraft had crashed during the operation, which had lead to a total of 101 deaths. 40 of them were British, 31 were Americans, 1 was Australians, and 15 of them were German civilians. And after this blockade had made many economic and ideological visions for Europe, this had played a major role in allying most of Europe into soon form NATO. Indonesian National Revolution. The Indonesian National Revolution, also known as the Indonesian War of Independence, was an armed conflict and diplomatic struggle between the Republic of Indonesia and the Dutch Empire in post-war and post-colonial Indonesia. Independence movements have begun on the May 1908, which is commemorated of the day as National Awakening. Indonesian nationalism and movements supporting independence from Dutch colonialism, such as the Bunta Utama, the Indonesian National Party, Sekat Islam, and Indonesian Communist Party. And they had grew rapidly in the first half of the 20th century, as Bunta Utama, Sekat Islam, and others had pretty much pursued strategies of cooperation by joining the Dutch-initiated Volksraad, or People Council, and hoped that Indonesia would soon become independent. But when World War II happened, and Japan would soon occupy Indonesia, but Dutch didn't even even defend most of their colonies. But when Japan had soon surrendered, it was eagerly received by the radical and politicized Pemuda groups that they pressured Sukarno and Hatta to proclaim Indonesian independence on the 17th of August, 2 days later. As soon, the first Indonesian flag was raised on the 17th of August 1945, and out of islands and many Indonesians far from the capital city did not believe it, as the news had spread, and most Indonesians had came to regard themselves as pro-Republican, and a move of revolution as soon swept the country. And there were many strikes and boycotts in Australia on coaling and loading in mainly the Dutch ships from Australia. And these strikes were fully broken on 1946, and Japanese, on the other hand, all things required by the term to surrender and both lay down their arms and maintain order. When many Japanese had surrendered, most of their weapons had pretty much went to Indonesians, and many Indonesians were even trained by the Japanese in World War II. And soon this would result in a power vacuum in Java and Sumatra in the following weeks. A Japanese surrender had created an atmosphere for uncertainty, but also came an opportunity for Republicans. Alongside when the Allies had soon occupied many parts of Indonesia, such as the Netherlands, United Kingdom, and the British Raj. And the revolution would soon lead into a war that lasted for 4 years. And majority of the Allies had controlled many major towns and cities and many industrial sites, while the Republicans had soon took control of many countrysides, alongside many Japanese holdouts were even still stationed in Indonesia. And there'll be very international pressure by 1949, as the United States threatened to cut off all economic aid for World War II, bringing efforts to the Netherlands if they didn't start this war, because there'll be many war crimes and many civilians be killed in this war. And then there'll be a partial military stalemate, which soon the Netherlands had transferred sovereignty over to the Dutch East Indies to the Republic of the United States of Indonesia. Casualties of this war, Indonesian civilians and combatants have been around 100,000 have been killed. Japanese volunteers who had pretty much still supported to fight the allies of this war, around over 500 have been killed. Indian defectors who had defected from India to pretty much fight for Indonesia have been killed, over around 500 as well. The Netherlands have lost over 4,000 troops. The United Kingdom have lost over 900 troops, and Japan had lost over 1,000 troops as well, because many Japanese, after like World War II, Japan has soon became, allies. And 5,000 to 2,000 Indo and European civilians have been killed in this war, alongside over 2,000 have been missing. Communist insurgency in Burma. Communist insurgency in Burma, which is now Myanmar, if I said it right, began right after World War II. The Communist Party of Burma and many other leftist groups initially fighting for independence from British rule, and then fighting the new opposing government led by U Nu. The Communist Party of Burma, alongside many other groups like the Karen National Union, had engaged in the armed conflict with the Burmese government for decades. And many internal conflicts in Myanmar is still ongoing to this day, as the conflict in Myanmar had pretty much led up to over 100,000 people have been killed in this conflict. And in the time I'm still talking about right now, there's currently a civil war going on in Myanmar. 8888 Uprising. The 888 Uprising, also known as the People Power Uprising, and the 1988 Uprising, was a series of nationwide protests, marches, and riots in Burma that had peaked in August 1988, which is, called 888. And protests began as student movements and were organized largely by many university students at the Rangoon Arts and Science University and the Rangoon Institute of Technology. As since the 1962 military coup in Burma, the Burman Socialist Program Party had ruled the country as a totalitarian one-party state, headed by General Ne Win under the government agenda that called the Burmese Way to Socialism, which had involved economic isolation and restriction of the military, and Burma had become one of the world's most impoverished countries, as many firms in the formal sector of the economy were nationalized, and the government had combined Soviet-style central planning with Buddhist and traditional beliefs and superstition. As the 888 Uprising had started in students on the 8th of August 1988, as students had protested and spread throughout the country, as hundreds of thousands of monks, children's universities, housewives, doctors, and common people protesting against the government. It soon ended on the 18th of September after a bloody military coup by the State Law and Order Restoration Council, as thousands of deaths have been attributed to the military during this uprising, while authorities in Burma have put the figure around 700, while many others have estimated around 10,000 people have been killed. 1957 United States Air Force incursion into Albanian airspace. On December 1957, a United States Air Force T-33 fighter jet had strayed into the Albanian airspace and was forced to land at Rinas Airport near Tirana. And the incident was a Cold War event that had involved interception and forced landing of American aircraft by two MiG-15s. Now, nobody did die, and it didn't cause a whole crisis, but it was still a very bad incident during the Cold War, as American pilot Major Howard J. would soon be detained, but he would soon be later released. And still to this day, the jet is still actually displayed in a museum in Albania. Years of Lead. The years of Lead were a period of political violence and social upheaval in Italy that lasted from the 1960s all the way up to the late 1980s, marked by a wave of both far left and far right incidents of political terrorism and violent clashes, as many sides who were either far right and many others who were far left had pretty much fought in Italy. And the Years of Lead had begun in 1968 movement in Italy in the hot autumn strike during 1969, at the death of policeman Antonio Amorona in November 1969, as the Piazza Fountain bombing in December of that year, which had killed 17 people. And throughout this conflict, there have been many terrorist groups in this conflict, such as many far-left terrorist groups such as the Red Brigade, Frontline, the October 22nd Group, the Armed Proletarians for Communism, the Continuous Struggle, the Workers' Power, the Workers' Autonomy, alongside many far-right terrorist groups such as the New Order, the National Vanguard, the Black Order, the NAR, and their position, which is alleged that both sides were actually supported by different areas during the Cold War, with the KGB supporting rumored to support many far-left terrorists, and the CIA was even alleged to support many far-right terrorist groups. As throughout the late 1960s and all the way to the late 1980s, there have been many terrorist attacks and many infighting between both the government, far-left terrorist groups, and far-right terrorist groups for pretty much power in Italy. And there'll be many assassinations, many car bombings, many fires, And after which, like throughout the 1980s into the 1990s, there have been a small resurgence of many Red Brigades terrorism that led to many assassinations, such as 1999, Massimo d'Antonio, a consultant of the Ministry of Labor, was assassinated. Even in 2021, there'll be arrests in France of many leftist militants too. And many countries have even granted asylum, like in many terrorist groups. As around 428 people, including civilians, have been killed during this conflict. Portuguese Colonial War. The Portuguese Colonial War, also known as in Portugal as the Overseas War, or the former colonies as War of Liberation, also known as the Angolan, Guineo-Bissau, and Mozambican War of Independence. This was a 13-year-long conflict fought between Portugal militaries against, many nationalist movements in, many Portugal African colonies between 1961 and 1974. As throughout after World War II, many colonies that were in control by Europe around the world have started to become independent because the Portuguese did not withdraw from its African colonies or other overseas provinces, as those territories have been officially called since 1951. And during the 1960s, various armed independence movements became active, like the People Movement for the Liberation of Angola, National Liberation Front of Angola, National Union for the Total Independence of Angola, African Party for the Independence of Ghana and Cape Verde, and the Mozambican Liberation Front. And during this whole conflict, many atrocities committed by all forces involved. And throughout the period, Portugal had faced many increasing distant and arms embargoes and other punitive sanctions from the international community, including by some Western Bloc governments. And many places such as the Soviet Union has supported many anti-colonial guerrillas in many places in Portuguese Africa. And back home at Portugal, this war would be very controversial, and it has soon will soon end. Especially with the Carnation Revolution, which was a military coup of April 1974 in Portugal, which had withdrawal resulted of many thousands, hundreds of thousands of Portuguese citizens from many places in the colonies, alongside many military personnel in Africa. And soon, most of these countries became independent. But conflict was not over in these countries, such as in Angola and Mozambique, which would lead to civil war. And the amount of deaths had died during this conflict was over 6,000 troops from Portugal had died in this war, and over 2,000 who were still supporting Portugal in Africa had died in this war. 30,000 troops in Angola was killed, 10,000 troops in Mozambique was killed, and 6,000 in Portuguese Ghana was killed, and around over 100,000 civilians were killed in total. Angolan War of Independence. Now, this is still following from the Portuguese Colonial War, but this is this right here is going to be based right here in Angola. This was a war of independence fought between Angolan National Forces of the MPLA, UNITA, and the FNLA against Portugal. As the Angolans had waged a guerrilla war to which Portuguese armies and security forces had conducted a counterinsurgency campaign against many armed groups who were mostly dispersed in sparsely populated areas of the vast Angolan countryside, and many atrocities were committed by all forces in the conflict, such as torture, executions, and many killing of civilians. And just like I just discussed it earlier, the war would soon end after a coup in Portugal, which had pretty much led to many, a mass migration of many Portuguese living in many places in Angola, and Angola would soon get independence. But this would not be the end, because right after this, Angola would soon go into a massive civil war that didn't end it until 2002, known as Angolan Civil War. As right after it had ended in 1975, it would continue all into 2002, as this war was against the MPLA and UNITA forces. And this would soon turn into a proxy war, as both sides of the Eastern and Western Bloc had pretty much wanted to assist in this war. As right after the end of the Angolan War of Independence, the parties of the conflicts had signed the Alva Accords on January 15, 1975. And in July 1975, the MPLA had finally forced the FNLA out of Luanda, and UNITA voluntarily withdrew its stronghold in the south. And by August, MPLA had controlled 11 of the 15 provincial capitals. And South Africa had still intervened by sending in between up to 1,000 to 2,000 troops from Namibia to southern Angola. As soon, South African and United forces had captured 5 provincial capitals, including Novo, Rio, and Bengala. In response to South Africa intervention, Cuba did not like this, because Cuba was, pretty much supporting MPLA, and they both had political ideologies, and Cuba will soon send 18,000 soldiers as a large-scale military intervention nicknamed Operation Carlota in support of the MPLA, which had pretty much started this proxy war. As this proxy war would be supported by MPLA would be backed by the Soviet Union, Cuba, East Germany, who even send troops there too, North Korea, who also sent troops there, but we don't know how many died, the Southwest African People Organization, the African National Congress, which is a political party in South Africa that, was anti-apartheid, which makes sense that they supported, the MPLA, the Congolese National Liberation Front, and Namibia in 2001. As United would be supported by South Africa, Zaire, and the United States as well to pretty much stop, Cuban and Soviet influence in Southern Africa. And one of the main leaders of United was Jonas Savimbi. And throughout the 1980s, the war would have been very bloody, and this would pretty much be one of the major events throughout the Cold War. Especially with Jonas Savimbi even forging many close ties with Ronald Reagan, even visited him too. And soon in the 1990s, the war would soon change a bit, as the MPLA would soon stop being a Marxist-Leninist political party, and would soon not have a one-party system no more, which had caused the Soviet Union and Cuba just to pretty much withdrew from Angola, especially since the Soviet Union was literally gone and Cuba just pretty much said, yeah, I'm just gonna go. And there'll be many peace accords throughout the 1990s, but they didn't really happen, especially with the United Nations even trying to pretty much stop the conflict from even breaking out, especially limiting certain arms for both sides. And United would even pretty much use diamonds in the mines that they had and pretty much sell them to pretty much fund the war and continue. But in the late 1990s into the early 2000s, the war would pretty much continue once again, especially in 2002 when Jonas Savimbi would soon be assassinated. As soon as August 2002, United would soon pretty much demobilize the armed forces, and Angola civil war would be soon over, as the MPLA would soon take control of the country, and the government is still in control of Angola to this day. This year would be one of the bloodiest wars in the Cold War, as around 800,000 people have been killed in this war, and 4 million people have been pretty much displaced. And there would have been many war crimes in this war, especially with child soldiers, as United had pretty much employed more than 600 child soldiers, and many human rights analysts have found between 5,000 and 8,000 underage girls were married to United militants, especially with the war still ravaged the country because there's still landmines in Angola in this war. South African Border War. The South African Border War, also known as the Namibian War of Independence, and sometimes denoted in South Africa as the Angolan Bush War, it was fought between the South African Defense Force and the People's Liberation Army of Namibia, and the armed ring of the Southwest African People Organization, which is also part of the Angolan Civil War as well. As following the year's unsuccessful petition to the United Nations and the International Court of Justice for Namibian independence from South Africa, the Southwest African People Organization formed the PLAN. And this war had pretty much started since 1966 all the way to March 1990. And soon it would soon gain independence and be the Republic of Namibia a year later. And this war also had a significant cultural and political impact in South African society. Over 2,000 South African soldiers would be killed in this war. Over 11,000 Namibian troops would be killed in this war, and it's estimated around up to 5,000 Cubans soldiers who had fought in this war were killed, and over 1,000 Namibian civilians were killed in this war. Invasion of Grenada. The United States invasion of Grenada and the coalition of Caribbean countries had invaded the island of Grenada, known as Operation Urgent Fury, by the United States military in 1983. And the background of the invasion was pretty much started all the way in the 1970s, as Sir Eric Gary had led Grenada to independence from the United Kingdom, but his term in office was marred by civil unrest, although his Grenada United Labour Party had claimed victory in the elections of 1976. And the opposition did not result as legitimate, and during his tenure, many Grenadians had believed that Gary was personally responsible for the economic decline of the island, and accused him of corruption. And another militia organized by the communist New Jewel movement, the NGM party. And when he was temporarily out of the country in 1979, Maurice Bishop and his MGM had seized power in a bloodless coup. He established the People's Revolutionary Government and suspended the Constitution and detained several political prisoners. As Bishop was forcefully speaker who introduced Marxist ideology to Grenadians, also appealing to black Americans in the 1970s heyday of the Black Panther movement. After his season of power, Bishop attempted to implement the first Marxist-Leninist nation in the British Commonwealth, because it was still part of the British Commonwealth at this time. But America was not really liking this, as well another communist country in the Caribbean could probably make tensions, especially when Grenada was even receiving support from Cuba, the Soviet Union, and Libya. And soon within a few days of these events happening in Grenada, the Reagan administration mounted a United States-led military intervention followed a formal appeal to help inform organization of the Eastern Caribbean states. As soon on 5 a.m. October 25th, 1983, U.S. troops were soon deployed to Grenada by helicopter. As an invasion force had comprised of over 7,000 troops, making it the largest military intervention since the Vietnam War. As it mainly comprised of the United States Army 75th Regiment, the 82nd Airborne Division, and other elements of the United States Marines, U.S. Army Delta Force, and Navy SEALs. As soon on days of this invasion, Hudson Austin was to be deposed from Grenada, and many Cuban and Soviet forces who were even stationed in Grenada would soon be expelled. And this here will be a very short invasion, as well. Ronald Reagan and many others had pretty much went to invade it to pretty much protect American students who were on Grenada. And this invasion did seem a little controversial, as Margaret Thatcher had pretty much approved of this invasion. And this would also be a holiday too in Grenada, as October 25th is called Thanksgiving Day to commemorate the invasion. And around 19 U.S. soldiers were killed during this conflict, and 45 Grenadian soldiers were killed, and 24 Cubans were killed in this conflict as well. And 24 civilians were killed in this conflict. Ramadan Revolution. The Ramadan Revolution, also referred as to the 8th of February Revolution and the February 1963 Revolution, or coup d'etat in Iraq, was a military coup by the Iraqi branch of the Ba'ath Party, which overthrew Prime Minister of Iraq, Abu Karim Qasim, in 1963, which took place between the 8th and 10th of February. While Qasim, former deputy Abdul Salim Aref, who was not a Ba'athist, as Abdul Salim Aref was given largely ceremonial title of president, while prominent Ba'athist general Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr was named prime minister. The most powerful leader of the new government was the Secretary General of the Iraqi Ba'ath Party, Ali Salih al-Sadi, hope I said it right, who controlled the National Guard militia and organized massacre of hundreds, if not thousands, following the coup. And the government lasted approximately 9 months until Aref disarmed the National Guard in November during the 1963 November Iraqi coup d'etat, which was followed by a purge of Ba'ath members. And the casualties during this revolution was around up to 5,000 elected civilians who were supporters of Qasim and of the Iraqi Communist Party was killed during a 3-day house-to-house search. This happened in 3 days. And the United States had also supported the Iraqi Ba'ath Party during this revolution to pretty much, stop many Iraqi communists, from getting power in Iraq during this revolution. September 30th Movement. The 30th of September Movement, or G30S, was a self-proclaimed organization of the Indonesian National Armed Forces members. In the early hours of the 1st of October, they assassinated 6 Indonesian army generals in a border coup d'etat. Later that morning, the organization had declared that it was in control of media and communication outlets and had taken President Sukarno under its protection. By the end of the day, the coup attempt had failed in Jakarta. Meanwhile, in central Java, there was an attempt to take control over an army division in several cities. By the time this revolution was put down, 2 more senior officers were dead. In the days and weeks that followed, the army, social, political, and religious groups had blamed the coup on the Communist Party of Indonesia. And soon after this, that blamed the Communist Party of Indonesia, a massive purge went underway, which resulted in imprisonment and deaths of many actual or suspected communist members. Indonesian mass killings of 1965 to 1966. These were large-scale killings and civil unrest, primarily members of supposed sympathizers of the Communist Party of Indonesia, which had happened after the September 30th movement. As this had targeted many communist sympathizers, Guarani women, trade unionists, ethnic Japanese Agbanan, ethnic Chinese, atheists who were so-called unbelievers, and alleged leftists. And the mass killings throughout Indonesia is very, well, hard to say, as many people estimate around to 1 million people were killed, while some people believe that up to 3 million people were killed. As many atrocities, even like described as a genocide or political side, were instigated by the Indonesian army. And research into classified documents have also show Indonesia has received support from countries such as the United States and United Kingdom during this mass killing. And after these mass killings have happened, many countries in the rest of the world have saw this as a victory over communism, even though many people were even killed throughout this. Especially when the CIA even had denied it, even though it's many evidence that they were involved throughout this mass killing. And people who even in prison were horribly tortured, as they'll be tortured in many horrible ways, which I can't even say, alongside men and women were both subjected to sexual violence. And some of the victims who were under this violence were younger than 13. Ifni War. The Ifni War, sometimes called the Forgotten War in Spain, was a series of armed excursions into Spanish West Africa by Moroccan insurgents that began in November 1957, as the city of Sidi Ifni had been succeeded to the Spanish Empire since the 1800s. By the end of the Hispano-Moroccan War, after Moroccan had achieved independence in 1956, it had started to claim Spain's remaining possession in West Africa. By violent demonstrations against Spanish rule had broke out in Ifni by April 1957, and then other Moroccan militias began converging near the territory. Moroccan forces attacked in November, forcing the Spanish to abandon most of the territory and retreat to the defensive perimeter around Ifni. And this was a small conflict that had lasted around from November to all the way to June 1958, with the Treaty of Anguilla de Cinta signed by the Spanish and Moroccan governments, by which Cape Judy and most of the Ifni territory would soon be transferred by Morocco. The city of Sydney Ifni remained in Spanish possession until 1969, when under international pressure it would soon go back to Morocco. And the casualties of this war would be around 190 dead Spanish soldiers and up to 1,000 Moroccan soldiers. Jeju Uprising. The Jeju Uprising was an uprising in South Korea that was an insurrection on Jeju Island in South Korea from 1948 to 1949. As a prior to its start, residents of Jeju had begun protesting elections scheduled by the United Nations Temporary Commission on Korea when the United Nations was still, in Korea before the Korean War, to be held as the United States self-occupied half of Korea, which they believe would entrench the division of the country. As a general strike later by the Workers' Party of South Korea from February to March 1948, the Workers' Party had launched an insurgency in 1948, attacking police and Northwest Youth League members stationed in Jeju, who had been mobilized to suppress protests by force. The First Republic of Korea under President Syngman Rhee executed the suppression of uprising from 1948 in August, declaring martial law in November, and beginning an eradication campaign against rebel forces in the rural areas of Jeju in March 1949, defeating them within 2 months. The resulting campaign had led to an event called the Jeju Massacre, as many captured rebels and splintered sympathizers would soon be later killed upon the outbreak of the Korean War. And some had even called this the start of the Korean War, and between 14,000 and 30,000 people, 10% of Jeju population were killed, and 40,000 have fled to Japan. And others estimated that around 80,000 people have been killed, and atrocities of war crimes were committed by both sides. And on October 2003, National Committee for Investigation of the Truth about the Jeju incident, chaired by South Korean Prime Minister Go Kun, released a comprehensive report detailing the violence that occurred during the uprising. South Korean President Roh Moo-in issued an official apology on behalf of the South Korean government. In 2019, South Korean police and the Defense Ministry apologized for their involvement in the massacres during the Jeju uprising. Operation Fair Play. Now, Operation Fair Play, also known as the 1977 Pakistani military coup, taking place on July 5th, 1977, as it was carried out by Muhammad Zia al-Haq, overthrowing the government of Prime Minister Zulfikar al-Bhutto. The coup was very bloodless and was preceded by many social unrest and political conflict between the ruling leftist Pakistan People's Party and government of Bhutto and the right-wing Islamist opposition. As Pakistani National Alliance, which accused Bhutto of rigging 1977 general elections and announcing the coup, as Muhammad Zia al-Haq had promised free, fair elections within 90 days, but they were repeatedly postponed on the excuse of accountability and didn't happen until 1985. As soon Zia himself had stayed in power for 11 years until his death in a plane crash in 1988. And this coup was very watershed in the event of the Cold War in the history of Pakistan, as it took place nearly 6 years after the 1971 war with India, which ended with the surrender of Pakistan and the accession of East Pakistan, which soon became Bangladesh. As this period also saw the elimination of Pakistan and Pakistan involvement with the Afghan Mujahideen during the Soviet-Afghan War. 1945 Guatemalan coup d'etat. 1945 Guatemalan coup d'etat had deposed democratically elected Guatemalan President Jacob Arbenz, arrested the right, and marked the end of the Guatemalan Revolution. And this coup had installed a military dictatorship of Carlos Castillo Amanos in the first series of US-backed authoritarian rulers in Guatemala. At this point, started the beginning of many U.S. intervention, during the Cold War in Latin America. As the Guatemalan Revolution had begun in 1944, after a popular uprising toppled the military dictatorship of George Upago, as Juan Jose Alvaro was elected president in Guatemala's first democratic election. As he introduced a minimum wage and near universal suffrage, he would soon be succeeded by Arbenz, who instituted land reforms and was granted property to landless peasants. As the Guatemalan Revolution was disliked by the United States government, which was, predisposed due to the Cold War, and they saw this revolution as communist. So they pretty much backed a coup, especially the United Fruit Company, which was a fruit company that traded many tropical plants on many plantations in Latin America, bananas and other fruits. As President Harry Truman had authorized Operation Fortune to topple Arbenz in 1952. As the CIA had armed and funded and trained over 400 militias led by Carlos Castillo Armas, as the United States effort to criticize and isolate Guatemala internationally, and Armas forces had invaded Guatemala on the 18th of June 1948, backed by a heavy campaign of psychological warfare as well as air bombings of Guatemala City and naval blockade. And the invasion force had faced poorly military and had lost many offensive were defeated by the United States military. And psychological warfare and fear of the United States invasion had intimidated the Guatemalan army, which soon had, refused to fight, as Arbenz had ostensibly attempted to arm civilians to resist the invasion before resigning. As soon Castillo Armas had became president 10 days later. Algerian War. The Algerian War, also known as the Algerian Revolution or the Algerian War of Independence, was an armed conflict between France and the Algerian National Liberation Front from 1944 to 1962, which led to Algeria winning independence from France. And this war wouldn't, unlike many wars during decolonization, many around the world, this war didn't just reach Algeria, but also places as in France. As started on the 1st of November 1944 during the Toussaint Rouge, also known as the Red All Saints Day, the conflict had led to serious political crisis in France, causing the fall of the Fourth Republic and to be replaced by the Fifth Republic, with strengthened presidency and the brutality of methods employed by the French forces had failed to win the hearts and minds in Algeria, which soon alternated support in metropolitan France and discredited French prestige abroad. As the war had dragged on, the French Republic had slowly turned against it, as many French key allies, including the United States, had switched from supporting France to pretty much, helping Algeria. As after major demonstrations in Algiers and several other cities in favor of independence in 1960, a United Nations resolution recognizing the right to independence, Charles de Gaulle, the first president of the Fifth Republic, decided to open a series of negotiations with the Algerian Liberation Front, and these concluded within the signing of the Yver Accords in 1962, which was a referendum that took place on the 8th of April 1962. As soon French had soon withdrawal led to a state crisis, including assassinated attempts on de Gaulle, as well as many military coups even tried to happen in France after this war. And this year would be a very bloody war, and the death tolls have went up to 400,000 to up to 1 million Algerians were killed in this war, and over 25,000 French soldiers were killed in this war. and 6,000 European civilians, alongside a massive refugee crisis had happened in France, with the majority of them being Algerian Muslims, and soon many Algerian Muslims who had moved to France after doing this war were even faced discriminated. And France during this war had pretty much tortured and killed many Algerians, majority of civilians, alongside incidents of Guatemalan Civil War. The Guatemalan Civil War was fought between 1960 up to 1996 between the government of Guatemala and various leftist rebel groups, as Guatemalan government forces had committed genocide against the Maya population of Guatemala during the Civil War, and there were widespread human rights violations against civilians. But the context of this conflict had went from land distribution. Wealthy Guatemalans, who were mainly of European descent, and foreign companies like the American United Fruit Company had control of much land, leading to conflicts within the rural indigenous peasants who worked on the land. As democratic elections in 1944 and 1941, which is during the Guatemalan Revolution, had brought popular leftist governments to power, and who sought to ameliorate working conditions and implemented land distribution. But when they did the coup in 1944 and started a military regime called Castile Armadas to prevent reform, Armas was followed by a series of right-wing military dictators. As Civil War began on 1960 when a group of left-wing junior military officers had led a failed revolt against the government of General Miguel Santos. Was it right? Again, I apologize. The officers who survived created a movement known as MR13, aka Revolutionary Movement 13th of November in 1970, as Colonel Carlos Manuel Arano Osorio was the first series of military dictators who represented the Institutional Democratic City, or the PID. And the PID dominated Guatemalan politics for 12 years through electoral frauds favoring the two colonels of, if I said it right, General Garcia in 1974 and General Romo Lucas Garcia in 1978. As the PID lost its grip on the Guatemalan politics when General Montt, alongside with a group of junior army officers, had seized power in a military coup in the 23rd of March 1982. In the 1970s, social discontent continued among large populations of indigenous people and peasants, and many organized into insurgent groups and began to resist the government forces. And by doing the late 1980s, Guatemalan military assumed close to absolute government power for 5 years. It is successfully infiltrated and eliminated enemies in every social and political institution of the nation, including political, social, and intellectual classes. In the final stage of the Civil War, the military developed a parallel and semi-visible, low-profile but high-effective control of Guatemalan national life. It's estimated around that 40,000 to 200,000 people were killed or disappeared forcibly during the conflict, as there were around over 50,000 disappearances. As fighting had took place between government forces and rebel groups, yet much of the violence were always in large, coordinated campaigns of one-sided violence by the Guatemalan state against civilian population from the mid-1960s onward. The military intelligence services coordinated killings and disappearance of opponents of the state. In rural areas where the insurgency maintained its stronghold, the government had repressed to large-scale massacres of many peasants and destruction of villages. As the first department of Izabala and Zapaca and part of Maya Western Highlands from 1978 onwards, the widespread killing of the Mayan people in the 1980s is considered a genocide, as other victims of repression included activists, suspected government opponents, returning refugees, critical academics, students, left-wing politicians, trade unionists, religious workers, journalists, and street children. And yes, America was involved during this conflict as well. Nicaraguan Revolution, or Nicaraguan Civil War. Now, this is still part of the Central American crisis, which was a major event where many civil wars and many communist revolutions happened in Nicaragua and other parts of Central America during the 70s and 80s. So the Nicaraguan Revolution, or its Nicaraguan Civil War, was an armed conflict that took place in Central America country of Nicaragua from 1978 to 1990. As it had began with the rising opposition of the Somoza dictatorship in the 1960s and 1970s, which overthrew dictatorship in 1978 to 1979. As fighting between the government and the Contras in 1981 was soon turned into a big proxy war. Now, following the United States occupation of Nicaragua from 1912 to 1933 during the Banana Wars, it was soon be implemented by a dictatorship by Somoza, which was characterized by economic development, alongside many political corruption and strong U.S. support for the government, because America was still supporting many places in Central America, mainly for bananas. In 1961, Carlos Abdor, if I said it right, had formed the Sandinista National Liberation Front, also known as the Sandinistas, which is a socialist political party in Nicaragua. As the revolution had begun in the 1970s, as the Sandinistas had begun a campaign of kidnappings which led to a national recognition of the group in Nicaragua media, and they had started as a threat to the ruling regime. And the ruling regime, which included the Nicaraguan National Guard, had trained and influenced by the United States military, had declared a state of siege, and had proceeded to torture and many people to pretty much combat the Sandinista attacks. And this had led to international condemnation of the regime. In 1978, the United States had cut off aid over its human rights violations. In response, some of us had lifted the state of siege and pretty much stopped doing all that horrible stuff to people. As far as riots and the general strike to call for the end of the regime, it was successful by shutting down around 80% of businesses in Magua and in many other cities as well. And on August 22nd, 1978, the Sandinistas had staged a massive kidnapping operation led by Adrian Pastera, and as the Sandinista forces had captured the National Palace while leisure was incessant, taking around 2,000 hostages, as they demanded money and release of Sandinista prisoners. And after 2 days, the government had agreed to release, certain prisoners and pay them $500,000. And Sandinistas would soon, do a successful urban offensive as they controlled many parts of the country, except the capital. And soon, the Somoza regime had pretty much, collapsed, as Somoza Dabali had fled to Miami. Ceding control to the revolutionary movement, his nationalist liberal party had become very, very defunct, and soon the Sandinistas would soon have to control. And Sandinistas would soon take power in 1979, but there'll be another group who will be fighting against the Sandinistas, and those would be the Contra Rebels. The Contra Rebels were a right-wing militia who waged anti-communist guerrilla warfare against the Sandinistas, and they were supported by, United States and CIA. But the Contras would be doing horrific stuff, such as many, death squads, alongside the Contras even supporting the drug trade in Latin America, which Congress did not like and would soon cut funding to the Contras, which would lead to the CIA to even, intervene in Nicaragua by pretty much sending sea mines to pretty much stop foreign weapons to entering Nicaragua, alongside even, starting the Iran-Contra affair. Peace process started with the Support Accords in 1980, and the Contra War ended after signing the Tele Accords in 1989 and demoralization of the Sandinista and Contra armies. In the second election in 1990 resulted in the election of the UNO, and the Sandinistas as soon lost power in 2006. But the Sandinista government, supporters of the government still exist to this day. This would be one of the bloodiest wars in the Central American conflict, as there will be many human rights controversies, such as Sandinistas committing many executions. The Contras had committed many horrific stuff, such as counts of mass executions in the drug trade, as around over 78,000 people have been killed in this war. Eritrean Civil War. The Eritrean Civil War were two conflicts that fought between the community organizations for the liberation of Eritrea. As this was against the ELF, the Eritrean Liberation Front, alongside the Eritrean People Liberation Front, and the Tigray People Liberation. And this was part of the Eritrean War of Independence and the Ethiopian Civil War. The first civil war was fought from 1972 to 1974, as the Eritrean Liberation Front had tried to suppress many groups that disliked the Eritrean Liberation Front leadership and wished to break away to form a new insurgency. At this time included Christians who resented alleged Islamic bias in the ELF, inhabitants of the coast regionalist concerns, and radical Marxists, as the ELF had failed to suppress many groups who soon became the Eritrean People Liberation Front. And the Second Civil War was fought from 1980 to 1981, as the EPLF had attacked the ELF when it had appeared that they were attempting to negotiate with a peace deal with the enemy Soviet and Ethiopian governments. And the ELF was defeated and pushed out of Eritrea, as the remnants of the ELF had soon left to Sudan, as over 3,000 people were killed in these wars. Bolivia campaign. Now, this here was a campaign that had pretty much made it happen in Bolivia, and it was part of a group known as the ELN, aka National Liberation Army of Bolivia, and it was mainly comprised of Bolivian and Cuban guerrillas, led by guerrilla leader Che Guevara, which is active in the Colombia province of Bolivia from 1966 to 1967. The group had established its base camp on a farm across the Nuchacazu River. Well, I said it right again, I apologize. As a seasonal tributary of the Rio Grande. And they had pretty much tried to make an armed resistance to pretty much overthrow the Bolivian government and create a socialist state, but they would soon be defeated, and those who were captured would either be executed, including Che Guevara, as only 5 guerrillas have managed to survive and have fled to Chile. And I'm surprised that this is on lesser known conflicts, because this had involved Che Guevara, who was a really important member in history. Also, when he was I think they killed him, his body was lashed to landing skids of helicopters and was flown by different parts of towns, which is very horrific. The Warsaw Pact invasion of Czechoslovakia. The August 1968 Czechoslovakian Republic would soon be invaded by the 4 Warsaw Pact countries: the Soviet Union, Polish People's Republic, the Republic of Bulgaria, and Hungarian People's Republic. This invasion had pretty much started during the Prague Spring, which was a mass period of protest and liberalization in Czechoslovakia Socialist Republic, as people trying to have better reforms and more freedom in Czechoslovakia, which the Soviet Union did not like and would soon invade. As around 250,000 Warsaw Pact troops, which soon went up to 500,000 troops, supported by thousands of tanks, hundreds of aircraft, had soon went into the operation, known as Operation Dumbu. Hope I said it right. And this would be an internal conflict within the Soviet Union. And this had made many other, communist-aligned countries, such as the Republic of Romania, Republic of Albania, to even, refuse to even, enter this war. And this invasion had caused a massive divide in the communist world, as many countries in the Eastern Bloc and other communist-aligned countries did not support it, such as China and Albania had continued to attack, while many other communist parties had lost, influence and denounced the Soviet Union. It is estimated around up to 130 civilians and soldiers were killed in Czechoslovakia, while around 96 Soviet troops were killed and 10 Polish troops were killed. Ethiopian Civil War. This was a civil war in Ethiopia that was fought between the Ethiopian military junta known as the Derg and the Ethiopian Eritrean anti-government rebels from the 12th of September 1974 all the way up to May 1991. As the Derg had overthrew the Ethiopian Empire and Emperor Haile Selassie in a coup d'etat in 1974, establishing Ethiopia as a Marxist-Leninist state under a military junta and provisional government. And various national opposition groups of ideology affiliations ranging from communists and anti-communists had often dawned on a specific ethnic background, had carried out armed resistance to the back Soviet Derg. As many groups like the Eritrean People's Liberation Front and the Western Somali Liberation Front had already begun fighting against the Ethiopian Empire and Northern Eritrean War independence in the Southern Ogaden insurgency. And the Derg had used large-scale counterinsurgency military campaigns and the Red Terror to repress the rebels, as other rebel fronts, including the Tigrayan People Liberation Front and the Oromo Liberation Front, had grew increasingly strength during the 1970s. And Somalia has soon invaded to back the Western Somali Liberation Front, pretty much starting another war, which would soon trigger a large-scale Soviet and Cuban military intervention that had drove back Somali forces. And Ethiopia would soon be in economic decline during the mid-1980s, as there would be a famine and many other stuff affecting Ethiopia. And many people, did not really like the new government doing this as well. As soon as the Derg had dissolved its military junta in 1987 and became a civilized and establishing People's Democratic Republic of Ethiopia under the Workers' Party of Ethiopia, in an attempt to maintain its rule, the Soviet Union had begun ending support for the Derg in late 1980s. And in May 1991, the Derg was defeated in Eritrea, and President Mengistu Haile Mariam had fled the country. And the Ethiopian Civil War had ended on May 28, 1991. And this would be a very deadly war, as around 500,000 people were killed in the war because of battles, but over 1 million people had died to a famine. Operation Independence. Operation Independence was a 1975 Argentinian military operation in the Tucumán province to crush the People's Liberation Army in a Jugavius guerrilla group, which had tried to create a Vietnam-style war front in northeastern province. And this will be also part of the Dirty War, which I'm gonna mix both of them. So yeah. After the return of Juan Perón to Argentina, marked by the 20th June 1973 Iceberg massacre, led to the split between the left-wing and right-wing prisoners. And the ERP would soon go to a world strategy designed to secure a land area for base for military operations against the Argentine state. By 1974, the guerrillas had numbered around 100 fighters with a 400-person support network. Its operation had lasted from like 1975 to all the way to 1977, which was part of the Dirty War to pretty much attack many communist guerrillas in Argentina. And this had left 70 Argentine soldiers killed and 300 communist rebels killed. Okay, now onto the Dirty War. The Dirty War, which is part of Operation Condor, which I had explained earlier in the Part 1 Iceberg, which still watch it if you haven't, while you're still here, was a massive espionage campaign launched by the United States to pretty much stop, many communist governments in Latin America, mainly by pretty much, supporting right-wing dictatorships in the southern cone of South America. And the Dirty War got its name by use of the military junta, or the civic military dictatorship of Argentina, for its period of state terrorism in Argentina from 1974 all to 1983. And during this campaign, military and security forces and death squads in the form of Argentine Anti-Communist Alliance hunted down many political dissidents and anyone who believed to be associated with socialism, left-wing peronism, and the Montoya movement. As around 22,000 up to 30,000 people were either killed or disappeared during this. And when I mean disappeared, I mean they just vanished, meaning they're either executed. In many homes who was impossible to formally document, however, the Argentine military intelligence at the time had estimated that around over 22,000 people have been murdered or disappeared. And the primary targets were either communist guerrillas, sympathizers, alongside including students, trade unionists, writers, journalists, artists, and any citizen of being like a left-wing activist, alongside the killing of many Argentinian Jews. But they would soon come to an end after the economic collapse in the 1980s and public discontent in the disastrous handling of the Falklands War, which resulted in the land end of the junta and restoration of democracy in Argentina, ending the Dirty War. And many people who were like part of the junta were either prosecuted and imprisoned for crimes against humanity and genocide, as well as results of their actions during the period. As around over 500 military and police personnel were killed in this conflict, over 1,000 civilians were killed, 5,000 members of the Montoya movement and over 5,000 members of the ERP were killed, and around 30,000 people have been killed or disappeared. And the United States had mainly supported this as well. So yeah, we did horrible stuff in the name to stop communism. The Indonesian invasion of East Timor. The Indonesian invasion of East Timor, also known as Operation Lotus, had begun on 1975 when the Indonesian military invaded East Timor under pretext of anti-colonialism and anti-communism to overthrow the Ferdinand government that had emerged in 1974. And the overthrow of the popular and short-lived Ferdinand-led government has sparked a violent quarter-century occupation in which approximately 180,000 people have been killed or starved to death. And this would soon lead to the occupation of East Timor to 1974 or to 1999, as well as a large part of consequences of Indonesian war crimes during Operation Dili, including over 18,000 violent killings and over 84,000 deaths from disease and starvation. Indonesian forces and their auxiliaries had combined responsible for 70% of the killings. And during the first month of the occupation, the Indonesian military had faced heavy insurgency resistance in the mountains interior of the island. But from 1977 to 1978, the military had procured a new advanced weaponry from the United States and other countries to destroy fraternal frameworks. In the last 2 decades of the century, I saw continuous clashes between Indonesian and East Timorese groups over the status of East Timor. Until 1999, when the majority of East Timorese had voted overwhelmingly for its independence, after a further of 2.5 years of transition, it will soon gain independence in 2002. Salvadoran Civil War. The Salvadoran Civil War was a 12-year civil war in El Salvador that was fought between the government of El Salvador, backed by the United States, and the FMLN, which is a coalition of left-wing guerrilla groups backed by Cuba under Fidel Castro, and the Soviet Union. This year was another war part of the Central American crisis, which had started on the 15th of October 1939 when a coup was followed by the government of killings of anti-coup protesters, which is widely seen as the start of civil war. And the war didn't really end until the collapse of the Soviet Union, but it would still be go on for another year until the peace accords were signed in Mexico City. And this war had killed more than 75,000 people alongside 8,000 disappearances and human rights violations, mainly with kidnapping, torture, and murder of many sympathizers by the state. February 28th incident. The February 28th incident, or the 228 incident, this was an anti-government uprising in Taiwan in 1947 that was violently suppressed by the KMT government of the Republic of China. Directed by the provisional government Chen Yai and President Chiang Kai-shek, thousands of civilians were killed in the beginning of February 28. The incident is considered to be one of the most important events in Taiwan modern history and was a critical impetus for the Taiwan independence movement. As in 1945, following the surrender of Japan at the end of World War II, the Allies handed administrative control of Taiwan over to China, thus ending the 50 years of Japanese colonial rule. And local residents have become resentful over they had thought of a high-handed and frequently corrupt conduct on the KMT authorities, including arbitrary seizure of private property, economic mismanagement, and exclusion from many political participation. The Faction Act came in 1947 in Taipei when agents of the state Monopoly Brew struck a Taiwanese window suspected of selling contraband cigarettes. An officer then fired into a crowd of angry bystanders, hitting one man who died the next day. Soldiers fired upon the demonstrators the next day, after which a radio station was seized by protesters and news of a vote had broadcast the entire island. And soon the uprising had spread all across Taiwan. As Chen Yi had called for military reinforcements, an uprising was violently put down by the National Revolutionary Army. 2 years later and 38 years later thereafter, the island will be placed under martial law in a known period as the White Terror. During the White Terror, the KMT had prosecuted and preserved many political dissidents, and the incident was considered a taboo to be discussed. As President Lee Teng-hui had become the first president to discuss the incident on his anniversary in 1995, which is now openly discussed, and the details have become a subject of government and accumulated investigation. As on February 28th is now an official holiday in Taiwan called Peace Memorial Day. And the number of deaths is actually unknown during this conflict as well, but many people estimate to be around 18,000 to 28,000. The Ugandan-Tanzania War. The Ugandan-Tanzania War was fought between Uganda and Tanzania from October 1978 all the way to June 1979 and led into the overthrow of Ugandan President Idi Amin. The war was preceded by a deterioration of relations between Uganda and Tanzania following Amin's overthrow of President Matteo Obote, who was close to the President of Tanzania. Over the following years, Amin's regime was disestablished by violent purges and economic problems. And the circumstances surrounding the outbreak of the war were not clear, as different accounts of the events exist. As in 1978, Ugandan forces began making incursions into Tanzania. Later that month, Ugandan army had launched an invasion, looting and killing civilian property, alongside even announcing annexation of different parts of Tanzania. As the war would now go on for several months, and Uganda would be backed by Libya and the Palestinian Liberation Organization, while Tanzania would be backed by Mozambique and many other Ugandan militias who did not like Idi Amin. And soon the war would end when Idi Amin was to be overthrown, bringing the war to end in June 3rd, 1979. But this would even start another war in Uganda, known as the Ugandan Bush War. It's estimated around 1,000 Ugandan soldiers were killed in this war, 600 Libyan soldiers were killed in this war, and 200 Palestinians were killed in this war. And Tanzania would have lost over 200 soldiers, and 150 Ugandan militants backing Tanzania would be killed. Ogaden War. The Ogaden War, also known as the Ethiopian and Somalia War, was a military conflict between Somalia and Ethiopia, which is part of the Ethiopian Civil War and the Eritrean conflicts, over sovereignty of the Ogaden region, as Somalia had launched an invasion in support of the Western Somalia Liberation Front insurgency, triggering a broader interstate war. The region had Jew disposal of the Soviet Union, which both the Soviet Union had supported Ethiopia alongside supporting Somalia, and they didn't really like that, so they pretty much stopped supporting Somalia and backed Ethiopia instead. This war had lasted for 8 days, but Ethiopia would soon have won the war, as the Soviet Union and Cuba had pretty much sent many supplies and even troops to pretty much help Ethiopia, and this would soon even affect Somalia as well, as around 6,000 Ethiopian Somalians would be killed in this war. Cuba had lost over 100 troops, South Yemen had deployed troops there to help as well, and 90 were killed, and the Soviet Union had lost 33 advisors, and around 25,000 civilians would be killed. Somali Rebellion. The Somali Rebellion had come with a series of armed uprisings against the President Said Barre government between 1978 and 1991, ultimately bringing down the Somali Democratic Republic and triggering a full-scale Somali civil war. It had took place in 1978, but mainly started right after the Ogaden War, when several army officers attempted a coup after the Ogaden War and then founded the Somali Salvation Democratic Front and a newly formed Somali National Movement that began mounting guerrilla operations based in Ethiopia. And during the 80s, the SSDF and SMF scaled in many campaigns, at one point culminating in a joint Ethiopian invasion of 1982, aimed at toppling Bayer. But it's only had caused a border conflict that has severely weakened the SSDF, and the SM have pressed on a hit and run assault against a government outpost across northwest Somalia, while Bears deployed his elite red berets to brutally suppress any clan-based dissidents profiling throughout the country. And other opposition groups sprang up, such as United Somali Congress in central regions and the Somali Patriot Movement in the south, as state authority had weakened Islamic movements such as Al-Ittihad al-Islamiyya had grew in strength and prompted many government crackdowns. However, no Islamic groups had took up arms after the whole state had collapsed, as Somalia was pretty much in a big state of anarchy during this time. The state had become very violent, culminating in the bombardment of Burbo and Hargeisa in the late 80s. And central ministries had ceased to function as civil servants went unpaid and foreign aid dried up, as clan loyalties that supplied national institutions. The July 1989 riots and massacres in Mogadishu had marked the first large-scale urban violence in the south. By 1991, the country was on the brink of collapse, and following a major battle between the regime and rebels in Mogadishu, the Somali Democratic Republic had collapsed in January 1991, making it the onset of the full-scale Somali Civil War, which this war had pretty much led to Somalia even fracturing whole after this. And the deaths during this event is up to 200,000 people. The Velvet Revolution. The Velvet Revolution, or the Gentle Revolution, was a non-violent transition of power that was in Czechoslovakia. Happening in late 1989, power demonstrations against the one-party government of the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia included students and order dissidents, which resulted in the end of 41 years of one-rule party in Czechoslovakia and the end of communism in Czechoslovakia as well. And this was part of the 1989 revolutions, when many revolutions around the world were pretty much ending the communism. As on November 17, 1989, riot police suppressed a student demonstration in Prague, and this had marked the 50th anniversary of a violent suppression demonstration against Nazis storming of Prague University. And these peaceful demonstrations went around to November to late December and aimed to turn into an anti-communist demonstration. As on the 20th of November, the number of protesters that had assembled in Prague had grew from 200,000 and soon went up to 500,000. In response of the collapse of other Warsaw Pact governments and increasing street protests, the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia announced on the 28th of November that it would relinquish the power and end the one-party state, alongside removing barbed wire from their borders from West Germany and Austria. And soon, in June 1990, Czechoslovakia held its first democratic elections since 1946. And on December 1992, Czechoslovakia split into two countries, the Czech Republic and Slovak Republic. And this was a very peaceful, revolution. Nobody died, but there would be many people who would be injured during the protest. The Boss Conflict. The Boss Conflict, also known as the Spain ETA conflict, was an armed and political conflict that went from Spain from 1959 to 2011 between Spain and the Basque National Liberation Movement, a group of social and political Basque organizations which fought independence from Spain and France. The movement was built around separatist organization ETA, which had launched a campaign of attacks against Spanish administrations since 1959, as ETA had been described as a terrorist organization by the Spanish, the British, French, and American authorities at different moments. The conflict occurred mainly in Spain, but also affected many parts of France, where the ETA had found refuge. And it was the longest running violent conflict in modern Western Europe, and sometimes even referred to Europe's longest war. And the ETA officially began an armed campaign in 1959, but the roots of the conflict dates back all the way to Franco's dictatorship of 1939 to 1935, which suppressed the Basque language, culture, and political expression during the Spanish Civil War, as Franco forces allowed the Nazis to pretty much bomb many parts of Spain. And this conflict pretty much go on after there being many terrorist attacks in Spain and France. And it will soon end on the 20th of October when the ETA announced a definitive cessation of its armed activity. Although that ended its violent campaign, the French government and Spanish government had regained control of many Basque territories. However, the border Basque nationalist movement still continues politically, as up to 900 people were killed during this conflict. Gwangju Uprising. The Gwangju Uprising, also known as in South Korea as the 18th Democratization Movement, was a series of student-led demonstrations that took place in Gwangju, South Korea in May 1980 against the coup of Chu Do-hwan. The uprising was violently suppressed by South Korean military in a massacre. As prior to the uprising at the end of 1979, the coup d'etat of May 17th resulted in the substitution of Chu Do-hwan as military dictator and the implementation of martial law. Following his ascent to power, Chun had arrested opposition leaders and closed all universities and banned political activities and suppressed the press. The uprising began in Chunam National University, where demonstrations by students against martial law were fired upon, and many students who even pretty much supported the uprising, they would be either killed or beaten by South Korean military. And some Gwangju citizens even took up arms and formed militias, raiding local police stations and armories to pretty much uprise against South Korean government during this time. And South Korea pretty much claimed that only 100 people were killed during this massacre, while many people who even witnessed it have believed up to 600 to 2,000 victims were killed. In 1997, May 18th was established as National Day of Commemoration for the massacre, and National Cemetery for the victims were established. Later investigations had pretty much confirmed that various atrocities have been committed by the army. In 2011, documents of the Gwangju Uprising were listed on the UNESCO Memory of World Registry. But many political groups in South Korea pretty much denied the Gwangju massacre. Romanian Revolution. The Romanian Revolution was a period of violent and civil unrest in Romania during 1989 as part of the revolutions of 1989. This was a violent revolution that pretty much saw the end of the Romanian Communist Party, even pretty much culmination in the death of Romania's last dictator, Nicolae Ceausescu. Even his wife was even executed as well, because their trial was pretty much literally execution trial, where right after they were found guilty, they shot him. And this revolution was very fast. It was lasted for a couple of days. The trial was even that long as well. And after this, Romania was no longer communist and would soon become part of NATO in 2004. And this revolution had caused the deaths of over 1,000 people. The Mongolian Revolution of 1990. Known in Mongolia as the 1990 Democratic Revolution, was a peaceful revolution that pretty much transitioned Mongolia to a multi-party system, as it was inspired by the economic reforms of the Soviet Union in the late 1980s, as pretty much this was the end of communism in Mongolia. And nobody died doing this, nobody even got injured, but it was a small revolution. Also, wanted to say this, Mongolia almost tried to join the Soviet Union before, because Mongolia had asked multiple times to join the Soviet Union, but the Soviet Union had said no because they didn't want more heat with China during the Sino-Soviet split. So yeah. Annexation of Goa. The annexation of Goa was the process of which the Republic of India annexed a Portuguese state from India, and then Portuguese India territories of Goa, Daman, and Diu started with armed action carried out by the Indian Armed Forces in India. As this action referred to the liberation of Goa, in Portugal, it was referred to the invasion of Goa. And this was pretty much the end of decolonization in Asia, in which pretty much started the end of decolonization for Portugal. As this was a small war for India and Portugal to much regain territories of many parts of India, and soon India would have won this conflict in 1961, as it literally lasted for 2 days. I'm not joking, it lasted for 2 days. And soon Goa was placed under military administration, and on June 1962, military rule was played by a civilian government, and soon it would be part of India. And this war had around 52 deaths during this conflict. Dhofar War. The Dhofar War was an insurgency from 1963 and 1976 in Dhofar against the Al Saud dynasty and British presence in Oman. This conflict began with the formation of the Dhofar Liberation Front, a Marxist-Leninist group which aimed to create a democratic state in Persian Gulf region. And the rebels also helped border the goals of Arab nationalism, which included ending British influence in the region. Omani and British goals, on the other hand, were to pretty much help and spread the communism, as this was part of the Arab Cold War. In the war, it actually took a form of low-level insurgency with guerrilla warfare being used against Omani forces and foreign presence in the country. A number of factors, such as the British withdrawal from the Aden and the support from newly independent South Yemen, as China and the Soviet Union had brought the rebels increased success, with communists controlling the entirety of Jabal region in the late 1960s. But soon there'll be a coup in Oman, in which the British would even assist Oman in this war for their own gain, as around 10,000 people will be killed in this conflict. The annexation of Dadra and Nagar Haveli. This was a process in which the territories of Dadra and Nagar Haveli was passed from Portuguese rule to independent rule with the Indian alliance in 1945. Dadra and Nagar Haveli were small, undefended Portuguese overseas territories, part of the Portuguese India, ever since they were handed over by the Matar Empire since 1779. The territories were enclaves without any access to the sea and administered by a Portuguese governor of the districts of Damao. After India had gained independence in 1947, some residents, with the help of volunteers from organizations such as the United Front of the Goans, the National Liberation Organization, and the Goan People Party, which is affiliated to the Communist ideology, and even the Communist Party of India, as well as supported by many national organizations such as the Azad Gomat Dal, I said it right, occupied Dadra and Nagar Haveli in 1944, and to place Portuguese rule. As this was a really short war and only 2 people were killed in this conflict. The Chadian Civil War of 1965 to 1979. This would be a civil war in Chad that was waged by several rebel factions against 2 Chadian governments. The initial rebellion was erupted in opposition to Chadian President Francois Tambalier, hope I said it right, who was murdered by his own army. And the military government headed by Felix Malloum had emerged and continued the war against the insurgents. As following foreign interventions by Libya and France, the fracturing of the rebels have went into rival factions and escalated of the fighting, as Malloum had stepped down in March 1979. As soon as it paved way for a new government. And this will soon lead into the Chadian-Libyan War, when there'll be a series of conflicts between Chad and Libya, as around 10,000 people were killed during the civil war. The Saur Revolution. This was a violent coup d'etat uprising that was staged in 1978 in Afghanistan by the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, which overthrew Afghan President Muhammad Khan, who himself had taken power in another coup in 1973. And Duad and most of his family will be executed after this coup as well, alongside many of his supporters and military officers who supported him will be purged and killed. And the successful PDPA uprising resulted in the creation of a socialist Afghan government that will soon be closer with the Soviet Union, with new Mohammad Takari serving as the PDPA General Secretary of the Revolutionary Council. And this revolution would have been very, very bloody, as this had caused a fighting throughout Afghanistan, as 2,000 people were killed in this conflict. And this had pretty much started as the beginning of a decades and continuous conflict known as the Afghan conflict, which will be war after war in Afghanistan. Costa Rican Civil War. The Costa Rican Civil War was a civil war that took place in 1 month, from March 12th to April 24th, 1948. And this conflict had followed the presidential election the 8th of February 1948, in which opposition candidate Otule Ulate defeated the ruling party Rafael Angele Cardon Gardera, and the pro-government representative who dominated the legislative assembly alleged that Ulate's victory was fraudulent. And on the 1st of March, they had voted to annul the results of the election, which triggered an armed uprising against Jose Figueres Ferrer, who was a businessman who had not participated in the elections, against the government of President Tulio Picado. An uprising was resisted by the small, ill-equipped Costa Rican army and more significant by the militias of the Communist People Vanguard Party, which was part of the governing coalition in the legislative assembly, and had voted to the annual presidential elections. As Figueres rebels rapidly defeated the government forces and their communist allies, forcing President Picado to step down and leave the country, along with former President Calderon Garcia. and about 2,000 people were believed to be killed during this war, making it the bloodiest event in Costa Rican history in the 20th century. Ongoing revolutionary process. Now, this was a period during the Portuguese transition to a democracy that had failed after a right-wing coup d'etat on the 11th of March 1975 and ended after a failed left-wing coup d'etat in the same year. And this had happened right after the Carnation Revolution, as this would pretty much be like the main reasons how Portugal became to a democracy. As there be many political changes, as Portugal would have no longer many colonies around the world, alongside when many refugees, millions of Portuguese refugees came back from many of their colonies in Africa and other parts around the world. Western Sahara War. The Western Sahara War was an armed conflict between the Sahrawi Indigenous Palestinian Front and Morocco from 1975 to 1991, being the most significant phase of the Western Sahara conflict. And this was a conflict which is an ongoing conflict, by the way, against the Kingdom of Morocco and the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic. As this had pretty much started right after the withdrawal of Spanish from the Spanish Sahara in accordance with the Madrid Accords, which it transferred administrative control to Morocco and Mauritania, but not sovereignly. As in late 1975, the Moroccan government organized the Green March of over 300,000 Moroccan citizens and escorted around 20,000 troops who entered Western Sahara, trying to establish a Moroccan presence. While at first it was met with during resistance by the Polisario Front, Morocco later engaged a long period of guerrilla warfare with Sahrawi nationalists during the late 1970s. And this war continued into a low intensity throughout the 80s, though Morocco had made several attempts to take the upper hand. In 1991, there'll be a ceasefire agreement which will soon be reached, and around 20,000 people will be killed in this conflict. 1973 Uruguayan coup d'etat. This was part of Operation Condor and was, a coup d'etat in Uruguay to pretty much, crush many leftists in Uruguay, as the Communist Trade Union Federalists had called a general strike and occupation of factories. And the strike lasted just over 2 weeks. As soon as this would be the dissolution of the General Assembly of Uruguay, as John Maura Barberi would soon become president and dictator of Uruguay. Political crisis in Ecuador. This would be a political crisis in Ecuador that had lasted from 1960s to 1970s, as Ecuador was in a political crisis stemming from President Jose Maria Velasco's fourth term, economic struggles, political infighting. It would soon lead the president to even be ousted by the military. So yeah, Ecuador was in a political crisis. Hello, I'm gonna say this for tier 2 real quick. So Costa Rican Civil War was labeled twice, so I'm just gonna cross out one of them here. Alongside the Liberian Revolution, I'm gonna skip this one because I discussed this in part 1. And so yeah, I'm gonna skip this one. And yeah, let's do it. The Malayan Emergency. The Malayan Emergency, also known as Anti-British National Liberation War, was a guerrilla war fought in Malaya between communist pro-independence fighters of the Malayan National Liberation Army and the military forces of the Federation of Malaya and the Commonwealth, aka the British Empire. The communists had fought to win independence for Malaya from the British Empire and establish a communist state, while the Malayan Federation and Commonwealth forces had fought to combat communism and protect the British and economic colonial interests. The term emergency was used by the war by the British to characterize the conflicts, as referring to it as a war, even though it was literally a war. They just want to, say, oh, it's an emergency. We're not actually, doing this. As this had begun right after, World War II, as in 1948, after Britain had declared a state of emergency in Malaya, after following attacks on many plantations by many communist forces that killed many British people on those plantations, which had been revenge attacks for the killing of left-wing activists. As leader of the Malayan Communist Party, Chin Ping and his allies had fled into the jungles and formed the MNLA to wage a war for national liberation against British colonial rule. As many of these fighters were veterans of the Malayan People Anti-Japanese Army, a communist guerrilla who previously trained and funded by the British to fight against in World War II. So pretty much using the same tactics as the British against them. And these forces would even have many support from many places in China, along with even Chinese citizens living in Malaysia during this time. And the British had attempted to starve out many of these rebels using scorched earth policies through food rationing, killing of livestock, and area spraying of herbicide of Agent Orange, which, if you saw part 1 and if you know history, Agent Orange was used in Vietnam War, which had caused massive damage to wildlife, to plant life, and even affected people too. And there'll be many war crimes too. There'll be many massacres, such as the Batacali massacre, as 24 armed civilians were killed by the Scots Guards, even using concentration camps. Yeah. And during the war, the British and Commonwealth forces hired over 1,000 Iban mercenaries from Borno to act as jungle tractors. With the tradition of headhunting, they had decapitated many rebels and even scalped them too. And when they had came to the public on public newspapers, many people had thought it was fake until they actually find out that it was really real, which, yeah. And soon, when they start taking pictures of the headhunters, cutting off people's heads, they started to actually try banning photos with the headhunters as well. As soon as this war was soon end in late 1960s, and Communist leader Chin Ping had renounced the insurgencies against the Malaysian government in 1968, as the second phase of insurgency was soon last to the dissolution of the MCP in 1989. And this war had caused the deaths of 11,000 people, and many people even compared this to calling it British Vietnam. Communist insurgency in Malaysia. Now, this is the second Malaysian emergency, happened right after the Malaysian emergency in 1968, and this had went from 1968 to 1989 between the Malaysian Communist Party and the Malaysian Federal Security Forces, alongside with support from United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand, and even Indonesia. But soon, this conflict was soon at end in 1989 when the MCP had signed a peace accord with the Malaysian government at Hat Yao in southern Thailand. As this coincided with the revolutions of 1989 with the collapse of many communist regimes around the world. And besides the fighting in the Malayan Peninsula, another communist insurgency also occurred in the Malaysian state of Sabah. And this war had the deaths of around over 500 people. Mexican Dirty War. Now, this was an internal conflict in Mexico that had ranged from 1960s to 1980s between the Mexican Industrial Revolutionary Party and the ruled government under the presidents of Gustavo Diaz Ordaz, Luis Echevarria, and Jose Lopez Portillo, which were backed by the United States government, and left-wing students and guerrilla groups. During this war, government forces had carried out disappearances, estimated around 1,200 people, alongside the use of torture. And this will be a government victory, as the war will soon end in the early 1980s, and is not really talked about much, but there will be many chances of many political prisoners being either executed, many people will be even disappeared, and around 7,000 people will be tortured. The Turkish Strait crisis. Now, this is a very interesting thing from the Cold War, as there will be this pretty much started way before the Cold War. And this started way before World War II, actually. This started out in 1936 and ended all the way to 1953. And this was a Cold War era territorial conflict between the Soviet Union and Turkey, as Turkey had remained very neutral throughout most of the Second World War. After the war had ended, Turkey was pressured by the Soviet government to institute joint military control passage throughout the Turkish Strait, which connects to the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. And the Turkish government had refused. Tensions in the regions had leading to Soviet show of forced demands for territorial concessions along the Georgia-Turkey border, as the invitation campaign was intended to prevent American influence or naval presence in the Black Sea, as well as weaken Turkey government and pull it into Soviet sphere of influence. As the Turkish Strait crisis was a catalyst, along with the Greek Civil War still going on, and the creation of the Truman Document. At its climax, it will soon motivate Turkey to turn to the United States and even join NATO. As soon as the Soviet Union was soon withdrew from the area, but it was still lead on to bury a lot of beef from the Cold War. Mozambican War of Independence. Now, this is once again part of the Portuguese colonial war. This was against the Mozambican Liberation Front and the Portugal forces that started from 1964 and ended with a ceasefire in 1974. Similar to all the other Portuguese colonial wars, this pretty much started early in 1960s, but ended with the Carnation Revolution. As soon, this would even lead into the Mozambican Civil War, as this was a war fighting between the ruling Mozambique Marxist Mozambican Liberation Front and the Rhodesia backed anti-communist insurgent fronts of Mozambican national resistance. A number of small factions, such as the PRM, the UNAMO, the COREMO, and the FUMO. As a Mozambican national resistance, were trying to establish a socialist party-run state that was heavily backed by the anti-communist governments of Rhodesia and South Africa to undermine the Mozambican Liberation Front support for militant national organizations within their own countries, because they were trying to support like many anti-colonialist groups in South Africa and in Rhodesia. And this would be a bloody civil war, as over 1 million Mozambicans were killed in the fighting or had starved to famine. An additional 5 million people would soon be displaced across the region. The Mozambican Civil War destroyed much of Mozambican critical infrastructure in rural areas, including hospitals, rail lines, roads, and schools. And both sides of the conflict were accused of committing numerous human rights abuses, including the use of child soldiers, indiscriminately assaulting civilian prisoners of the countryside with landmines, and 3 neighborhood states, Zimbabwe, Tanzania, and Mali, soon even deployed troops into Mozambique to develop their own economic entrance against these attacks, because it was spreading into their region as well. Islamist uprising in Syria. The Islamist uprising in Syria was a series of protests, assassinations, and bombings and armed revolts led by Sunni Islamists, mainly members of the Fighting Vanguard and the Muslim Brotherhood, from 1976 until 1982. As uprising had aimed to establish an Islamic Republic in Syria, led by overthrowing the neo-Ba'athist government, which was described by the Ba'ath Party as a long campaign of terror. After 1980, the public resistance to the Ba'ath really expanded with the coalition of Islamic operation groups creating nationwide strikes and protests and revolts around Syria. During the violent events, resistance militias attacked the Syrian Arab army bases and carried out political assassinations of the Ba'ath Party, conduits, army officials, and Soviet military advisors. In the bureaucrats linked to Assad family, civilians were also killed in retaliatory extracts conducted by security forces. And the uprising had reached its climax in 1982 Hama massacre, during which the Syrian government had killed up to 5,000 to 40,000 civilians. 1973 Chilean coup d'etat. This was a military overthrow of the Democratic Socialist President of Chile, Salvador Allende, and his popular unity coalition government. Allende, who has described to be the first Marxist to be Democratic elected president in Latin America, liberal democracy, had faced significant social unrest, political tensions with the opposition to control National Congress of Chile. As on 11th of September 1973, a group of military officers led by General Augusto Pinochet had seized power in the coup, ending the civilian rule. As following the coup, the military junta was soon established and suspended all political activities in Chile, suppressed left-wing movements such as the Communist Party of Chile, the Socialist Party of Chile, and the Revolutionary Left Movement. And this coup had led up to over 70 deaths, and would even lead up to another conflict in Chile known as the Armed Resistance in Chile from 1973 all the way to 1990. As following the coup, armed leftist resistance movement against Pinochet dictatorship had developed all the way until 1990, when democracy was soon be restored. And this conflict was part of the South American theater in the Cold War, and part of Operation Condor, when America was backing many South American dictatorships. And this armed conflict had pretty much saw the main government of Chile fighting many communist leftist guerrillas, such as the MIR, the Lateral Youth Movement, and many others, which would be backed by Nicaragua, Cuba, Soviet Union, Czechoslovakia, Libya, North Korea, the EPR party in Argentina, and many other left-wing parties in Latin America. While Chile would be supported by the United States, United Kingdom, West Germany, Israel, and South Africa during this conflict. As there would be many sabotage attacks in Chile during this war, until soon Pinochet would even been almost assassinated, until he would soon step down later on in 1988, and majority of the armed groups would soon be demobilized in 1990. But there will still be many armed conflict in Chile, as there will be many assassinations, bombings, kidnappings, and armed robberies all the way up until 2010. And the main casualties of this war is above in the 2000s. Dominican Civil War. The Dominican Civil War, also known as the April Revolution, had took place between April all the way to September in 1965. As in Central Dominican Republic, it started when civil and military supporters of the overthrown Democratic elected President Juan Bosch ousted the military installed President Donald Weed cabal from office. The second coup prompted General Elias to organize elements of the military to loyal dictator Weed and many loyalists, initiating an armed campaign against the constitutional rebels. An allegation of common support had led to the rebels led to the United States invasion, codenamed Operation Powerback, which soon later translated into the Organization of American States occupation of the country by the Interior American Peace Force. As this toll had went up to over 1,000 Dominicans had killed in this war, and 47 United States soldiers would be killed in this conflict as well. And soon in 1966, elections would be held, and with the aftermath of which Joaquin Balaguer, if I said it right, was elected. And later on, soon foreign troops would be soon departed from the country. Paraguayan Civil War, 1947. This was also known as the Barefoot Revolution, and the Third Paraguayan Civil War was a civil war in Paraguay that lasted from the 7th of March to the 20th of August, 1947. As President Eugenio Moyano had suspended the constitution and had banned political parties. And resistance to his rule had took the form of general strikes and student riots, as in 1946, Moyano had legalized political activity and formed a cabinet with the Federalista Revolutionary Concentration in the Colorado Party. And the Federalistas resigned from the coalition on January 11, 1947, aiming that Moyano had seen favoring the Colorados. And the Federalists had made common cause with the Liberal Party and the Paraguayan Communist Party, as former Paraguayan president and founder of the Federalistas, Rafael Franco, had led a rebellion that mushroomed into a civil war, as Paraguayan armed forces, which had previously remained loyal, split, and Communist Party had become very active. And with this being the start of the Cold War, this would be one of America's first instances as well that pretty much try to intervene in Latin America to stop communism. As soon Higano Moyano government would soon have won and took control of Paraguay in 1947. July 14th Revolution. The 14th of July Revolution, also known as the 1958 Iraqi military coup, was a coup d'etat that took place on the 14th of July 1958 in Iraq, resulting in the toppling of King Faisal and the overthrow of the Hashemite Kingdom of Iraq, and the Iraq Republic was to be established, which ended the Hashemite Arab Federation between Iraq and Jordan that had just been established 6 months earlier. As the Kingdom of Iraq had been a hotbed of Arab nationalism since the Second World War, as unrest mounted the economic malleus and widespread disposal of Western influence, which is exacerbated by the formation of the Baghdad Pact, as well as faster support of the British-led invasion of Egypt during the Suez Crisis. And Prime Minister Now al-Assad policies were very unpopular within military ranks, as opposition groups had begun to organize secret modeling themselves as the Egyptian Free Officers Movement that overthrew the Egyptian monarchy in 1952. As apparent Arab sentiment in Iraq was further bolstered by the creation of the United Arab Republic in 1958 under the leadership of Gamal Abdel Nasser, who was a staunch proponent of anti-imperialist cause. In July 1958, units of the Royal Iraqi Army were displaced to Jordan in support of King Hussein by a group of Iraqi free officers led by Brigadier Abad al-Karim Qasim and Colonel Abdul Salim Arif, and took advantage of the opportunity and had instead marched on Baghdad. As on 14th July, revolutionary forces had seized control of the capital and became a new republic. And the royal family was soon, tried to attempt to flee, but they were soon captured and shot a day later. After the coup, Qasim assumed the position of Prime Minister and Minister of Defense. Al-Arif was named Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of the Interior. After the new Iraqi government had pretty much withdrew from the Baghdad Pact and soon aligned itself with the Soviet Union, as 100 people will be killed during this coup, alongside 3 U.S. citizens. Vlora Incident. The Vlora Incident was a military confrontation between Albania and the Soviet Union that lasted from March 28th to June 8th, 1961, as the Albanian army had blockaded the Vlora naval base, leading to the seizure of Soviet ships and equipment. As the incident underscored the escalating diplomatic tensions between the two nations, ultimately resulting in the expulsion of Soviet forces from Albania, which is part of the Soviet-Albanian split. As several Soviet sailors would even be killed by Albanian soldiers, while it's no reported casualties from Albania. 1969 Sudanese coup d'etat. The 1969 Sudanese coup d'etat was a successful coup led by Colonel Ghaffar Nimri against the government presidential al-Azhari. The coup has single-handedly ended the Sudan second democratic era and saw the beginning of Nimri's 16-year rule, as Nimri government was soon and pursue a very radical Arab nationalist and leftist program, bringing in a socialist program for social and economic development, including widespread nationalization of private property. However, this will also push for the end for the First Sudanese Civil War, which I'll discuss later. Because before this, Sudan was, well, in control by both United Kingdom and Egypt, but soon will gain independence on the 1st of January 1956, as al-Azhari of the National Unionist Party had become prime minister, leading to the government within the Sudanese Sovereignty Council. However, political instability had led to a vote of seizure, replacing Zahari with Abdullah Khali of the Ummah Party. And in July 1956, these years have saw shifts in power dynamics in legislative elections. As in November 1958, Lieutenant General Imam Abdul with Khali had orchestrated a military self-coup, suspending the constitution and dissolving the parliament, and establishing the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, and this had led to a state of emergency and diplomatic recognition from various countries. As amid resistance on October 1964, revolution had soon emerged as widespread protests had erupted against Abdul's rule, and revolution had begun with a student-led demonstration in the city of Rad Midi, and will soon spread to many other places in Sudan, even to the capital. An interim government was soon formed following Abdul's resignation, with the Sudanese Sovereignty Council being at the helm of the government and Sir al-Khatem al-Khalifa was set right as prime minister. Notably, the Ummah Party had played a central role in the Constituent Assembly elections. As soon there will be a coup led by Colonel Ghaffar Nimri beginning in the early mornings of the 25th of May 1969. As many areas of Sudan capital have been occupied, leading a Sudanese army generals to be arrested. And at 7 a.m., radio broadcasts have recorded speeches by Nimri setting up their plans for a new government, alongside, well, the radio even broadcast new council of ministries. And this coup will also, well, push for peace for the Sudanese Civil War, which I'll discuss a little later. 1969 Somali coup d'etat. Now this here was a bloodless military takeover of the Somali Republic on the 21st of October 1969, led by Somali National Army officers of the Supreme Military Council under General Syed Barre. After the assassination of the president in Los Anod, the Somali National Army under Barre's command had stormed Mogadishu and seized many key government buildings and demanded resignation of the country leaders. The coup had disposed acting President Sheikh Muhtar Hussein, who I said it right again, and Prime Minister Muhammad Agal, ushering a 20-year military rule under Barre until it had lasted until the rebellion in 1991. First quarter storm. The first quarter storm, often short as to the FQS, was a period of civil unrest in the Philippines which took place during the first quarter of the year 1970, as it included a series of demonstrations, protests, and marches against the administration of President Ferdinand Marcos. As these protests were mostly organized by students and supported by workers and peasants and members of the urban poor community. From January 26, 1970, all the way to March 17, 1970, protesters at these events had raised issues related to social problems, authoritarianism, alleged electoral fraud, and corruption at the hand of Marcos. And violent despoils, various of the first quarter storm protests were among the first watershed events in which a large number of Filipino students of the 1970s would soon be radicalized against Marcos' administration. And due to these despoils, many students who previously held moderate positions have became no choice but be more radical social change. As soon as even leading to martial law in the Philippines. 1971 JVP insurrection. The 1971 JVP insurrection, also known as the 1971 revolt, was the first two unsuccessful armed revolts conducted by the communist junta Vimukthi Parami against the Socialist United Government of Sri Lanka. As the revolt had begun on the 5th of April 1971 and lasted until June of that year, as insurgents had held towns in rural areas for several weeks, until the regions were seen recaptured by other armed forces, and following a strong support from friendly nations that had sent men and material, such as India, Pakistan, and Soviet Union. Which is really surprising to hear that all three of those countries even help each other, and they didn't really like each other most of the time during the Cold War. And there will be another insurrection as well in the 1980s, but it will soon also fail as well. And this will be a small conflict, but it will be many deaths as well, as Sri Lankan government had lost around 26 people in the armed forces to be killed, alongside police members, 37 were killed, while the rebels had lost 15,000. And North Korea even supported the rebels, but we don't know how many their death is. we don't know. And the in total deaths is very complicated, as the government estimated around 12,000 people were killed, while many others estimated that around 20,000 were killed, and many activists even estimated around 50,000 were killed. 1971 Uganda coup d'etat. 1971 Uganda coup d'etat was a military coup d'etat that overthrew the president of Uganda, Milton Obote, and the coup had occurred on the 25th of January 1971. Obote was attending the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in Singapore. And this stage was started by Idi Amin, commander of the Ugandan army at the time. And for various reasons, relations between Obote and Amin and his army commander have become very strained, as Amin plot, allegedly under Israelis who helped the coup, was primarily driven by a concern to retain power over the military, hence guaranteeing his own personal survival after the coup success, as Amin installed himself as president, ruling until 1969. But Idi Amin will be one of the brutalest dictators in modern history, as he will kill anyone who spoke against him, alongside even exiling many Asians from the country. It's estimated around 100,000 between 500,000 people were killed under his regime. So yeah, he was not a good guy. Well, he was a dictator, so it makes sense. Also, watch Last King of Scotland. It is a great movie that is based around his coup and his rule. Forrest Whitaker did an amazing job as Idi Amin. First Yemeni War. This was a short military conflict between the Yemen Arab Republic, which is North Yemen, and the People's Democratic Republic of Yemen, which is South Yemen. Now, this war was initiated by North Yemen, started on the 26th of September 1972, with the 10th anniversary of the start of North Yemen Civil War, which I'll discuss later. As a force comprised of different political groups and exiled tribesmen from South Yemen, equipped with Alvis Saladin armored cars provided by Libya and artillery donated by North Yemen Army, had invaded South Yemen in the Quatabad area. In response, South Yemenis had brought several of their battalions in the area to pretty much push them back, and would soon start a bombing campaign over North Yemen. And the war only lasted for 23 days. It was followed by the Cairo Agreement of October 28th. I was pushed plans for peace, and we even pushed plans to even unify the countries in a Republican National Democratic state based on free and direct elections, as around 200 people were killed in this war. Second Yemeni War. This was another conflict that was fought between North Yemen and South Yemen, as this war had developed out of a breakout between relations to the two countries after the president of North Yemen, Ahmad al-Ghamisi, was killed on the 24th of June, 1978. And Salam Rubal Ali, who was a Maoist who had been working on a proper merger between the two Yemens, was soon murdered 2 days later, as hostilities of the rhetoric from the new leadership of both countries soon escalated, leading to small-scale border fighting, which then turned to a full-blown war in 1979, as North Yemen appeared on the edge of the decisive defeat after a three-front invasion by South Yemen combined forces. However, this was prevented by a successful mediation from the Kuwaiti Agreement of 1979, which resulted in Arab League peacekeeping forces to be deployed to the area. As soon as the agreement would be soon to be able to unite the countries, although it would be not implemented, as over 1,000 people would have been killed in this war. Brunei Revolt. The Brunei Revolt, or the Brunei Rebellion of 1962, was a December 1962 insurrection in the British protectorate of Brunei by its opponents of its monarchy, proposed as an inclusion in the Federation of Malaysia. The insurgents were members of the TNKU, which is a militia supplied by Indonesia and linked to the left-wing Brunei People's Party, which favored North Borneo Federation. As the TNKU had begun a coordinated attacks in the oil town of Syria, targeting many Royal Dutch shale oil installations, on police stations, and on government facilities around the area. And the revolt had begun to break down within hours, having failed achieve key objectives such as the capture of the Brunei Tau and the Sultan of Brunei, Omar Ali Saifuddin III, as the revolt had influenced the Sultan's 1963 decision to not join Malaysia. And it is seen to be one of the first stages of the Indonesian-Malaysian confrontation, as around 46 people will be killed, and it's very unknown of how many civilians were killed during this. Nigerian Civil War, also known as The Biafran War, or the Nigerian Biafra War, was fought between Nigeria and the Republic of Biafra, which was a secessionist state which had declared independence from Nigeria in 1967, when Nigeria was led by General Yakubu Gowon and Biafra was led by Lieutenant Colonel Emeka. The conflict had resulted from a political, ethnic, and cultural and religious tensions which preceded the United Kingdom's formal decolonization of Nigeria. As immediate causes of the war in 1966 included a military coup, a counter coup, anti-Igbo programs in the northern region, and programs in the exodus of surviving Igbos from the northern region into the Igbo homelands into the eastern region, led by leadership of the eastern region to conclude that the Nigerian federal government would not protect them, that they must protect themselves and intimidate Biafra. This would be a very bloody war, as Nigerian troops were surrounded by Biafra and capturing many cities and ports, and a blockade was even imposed. Within 2 years of the war, there were around 100,000 military casualties, and between 500,000 and 2 million civilians in the Biafra regions had died of starvation. And alongside with the Vietnam War, this was one of the first wars in human history to be televised in a global audience. As the war would soon end in 1970, but this would be a very, very bloody war which had caused a famine, and many people even called this war was a genocide, as around millions of people who have been killed in this war. 1979 Equatorial Guinea coup d'etat. This was a coup when Persecuso Messiah Miguel nephew, if I said it right, had overthrew him in a bloody coup. As soon fighting had began between loyalists and rebels had continued all the way up until he was captured, fleeing for Kairouan on August 18th. And he was sentenced for death of crime against genocide against the Bubi people and other crimes committed, and he would be executed by firing squad. As Teodoro, who was Francisco's nephew, had pretty much stayed in power for a very long time after this coup. And this coup had caused the death of around 400 people. The March 13th Revolution of 1979. This was a revolution known as the Grenada Revolution, referred to the coup d'etat in Grenada, where Maurice Bishop and the New Jewel movement overthrew the government of Prime Minister Eric Gary. As the event had marked the beginning of the People Revolutionary Government and a period of significant social and political change for the island nation. And this coup was very bloodless, but it would soon lead up to the invasion of Grenada by the United States military. Cardenista invasion of Costa Rica. This was a small rebellion carried out in the North Costa Rica by loyalist forces to the disgruntled former President Rafael Calderon, and was supported by the government of Nicaragua, who was unhappy of the election of José Pepe Figueres, prior to Costa Rican presidency, who won 2 years prior. As the rebellion had started on the 7th of January 1955, and loyal forces to the former president were backed by Nicaraguan President Antonio Somoza Garcia, had crossed the border from Nicaragua into Costa Rica, as Venezuela dictator Marcos Pérez Jiménez had provided financial support to the rebels and reportedly air support, as the rebels have seized the border town of Villa Cristera on 12th of January. And many people had accused the CIA of covertly aiding Nicaragua's invasion of Costa Rica by sending pilots and sorties to covertly attack Costa Rica, which had pretty much caused Costa Rican government to appeal to the Organization of American States to investigate. And the Organization of American States had found that the Nicaraguan government was supporting the rebels as soon it was announced, and the Nicaraguan government ended the support of rebels, and the United States sold Costa Rica 4 fighter planes. While the rebels were overwhelmed and probably backed by government forces, after some fierce fighting in a handful of northern towns, they would be soon pushed out of Costa Rica, as around 97 people will be killed in this. Rhodesian Bush War. Also known as the Rhodesian Civil War or the Zimbabwe War of Independence, was a civil conflict from 1964 all the way to December of 1979 in the unrecognized country UDI Republic of Rhodesia, which was later a temporary British colony of the Zimbabwe Rhodesia, which is now independent Zimbabwe. As this was one of the major wars and forgotten wars from the decolonization of Africa. And the conflict had pitted 3 forces against one each other: the Rhodesian right minority led by the government of Ian Smith, and militant African guerrillas organizations such as the Zimbabwe African National Liberation Army and the Zimbabwe People Revolutionary Army, As this war and its subsequent internal settlement was signed in 1978 by Smith Moraze, what had led to the implementation of the universal suffrage in June 1979 and the end of white minority rule in Rhodesia, which would soon be named to Zimbabwe Rhodesia under a black majority government. However, this new order had failed to win international recognition, and the war was soon continued, and neither side achieved a military victory, and the compromise would soon be later reached. As soon to be many negotiations with the governments, as at Lancaster House in London in December 1979, and the Lancaster House Agreement was signed, as the country would soon return to a temporary British control, and the new elections would be held under a British and Commonwealth supervision. As in March 1980, Mugabe had become the first Prime Minister of Zimbabwe, and on 18th of April, the country would soon gain internationally recognized independence, as around 20,000 people would be killed in this war. It is sometimes even called Africa's Vietnam. The Football War. Also known as the Soccer War or the 100 Hours War, this was a brief military conflict fought between El Salvador and Honduras over a football match. One of the reasons was because of a football match, but wasn't the main reason. Because a lot of, clickbait YouTubers always say, oh, they always fought because of football. Yeah. They didn't really fight because of football. It's mainly because of, immigration. As the roots were issues over in land reform in Honduras and immigration and democratic problems in El Salvador. As Honduras had more than 5 times of the area neighboring of El Salvador, by 1969, population of El Salvador was very larger than Honduras. And at the beginning of the 20th century, Salvadorans had begun migrating to Honduras in large numbers. By 1969, it was more than 300,000 Salvadorians that were living in Honduras, making up 10% of the population. In Honduras, as Central America, majority of the land was owned by large landowners or big corporations, such as the United Fruit Company, owning 10% of the land, making it hard for the average landowner to even compete. In 1966, United Fruit Company had banded together with many other large companies to pretty much create a national federation of Honduran farmers and ranchers. And this group had put pressure on the president of Honduras to protect many wealthy landowners, and many of which were Salvadorian. In 1962, Honduras had simply enacted a new land reform law, and this law had given the government and many other people much of land occupied illegally by Salvadoran immigrants, and redistributed that to native-born Hondurans. And the land was taken from both immigrant farmers and squatters regardless for their claim ownership or immigration status. And this had created problems for Salvadorians and Hondurans who were married, as thousands of Salvadoran laborers were either expelled from Honduras, including both migrant workers and long-term settlers. And soon both countries will even meet in the 1969-1970 FIFA World Cup qualifier. The first game was held in Honduras' capital. As on 8th of June, the Salvadoran team was harassed by Honduran fans at their hotel night before the match, as Honduras had won 1-0, causing Salvadoran fans to even set fire to the stadium. The second game was held in San Salvador, which is El Salvador capital, on 15th of June 1969. As Salvadoran fans who seeking vengeance rioted outside of the Honduran team hotel, leading to several deaths. At the match start, they had hanged up a dirty rag was flown instead of the Honduran flag, and it was won 3-0 by El Salvador. As anti-El Salvador had started all happening all across Honduras following the loss. And soon, many Salvadorians would either be harassed and were forced to flee Honduras within the days of the second match. And soon, border skirmishes even happened across the border. And then the war had started on the 14th of July 1969, when El Salvador had pretty much attacked Honduran airfields. Alongside the Salvadoran army even launched 2 front invasion of Honduras to pretty much secure the prosperous Sula Valley, while others had marched along the Pan-American Highway towards the capital, to pretty much take the capital. And this war had pretty much upset at many places in the Americas. Even the Organization of American States had pretty much negotiated a ceasefire on the night of the invasion. Even though this war was short, this would be very violent and would have many consequences, as El Salvador has up to 700 casualties, including over 100 deaths, and 3 aircraft were also destroyed in many air raids. While Honduras has suffered around 99 deaths, and it's estimated around 2,000 civilians have been killed, and 300,000 Salvadorians have been displaced and will be forcibly exiled from war-torn Honduras into El Salvador, in which the government was not even welcoming them, as most of the refugees were very homeless. And although it had started the war with the football match, El Salvador had played in the World Cup, but it was eliminated after losing 3 matches against the Soviet Union, Mexico, and Belgium. So yeah. The Iran Crisis of 1946. The Iran Crisis of 1946 was the aftermath of the Second World War and would be the prelude into the Cold War, as this was known as the Azerbaijan Crisis, sparked by the refusal of Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union to pretty much relinquish occupied Iran territory despite repeated assurances. At the end of World War II should have resulted in the end of the Allied joint occupation of Iran instead, as post-Soviet Iranians have proclaimed the separatist Azerbaijan People's Government in the Kurdish Separatist Republic of Mahabad. The United States had pressured the Soviet Union to withdraw its earliest evidence of success that would become the new strategy of the Truman Document and containment, pretty much trying to stop communism from spreading in Asia. As in August 1941, Iran would have been invaded and occupied by Allied powers. The Soviet Red Army had invaded from the north, while the British had invaded in the south, as Iran was used by the Americans and British as a transport hub to pretty much send many supplies to the Soviet Union war efforts. And after the matter of the occupation of Iran, those Allied forces have assumed agreed from withdraw from Iran for 6 months after the end of the war. However, the Soviet Union did not. Joseph Stalin had pretty much wanted to stay in Iran. It would even make many alliances and marine groups in Iran, trained by the Soviet Union, and engaging by fighting with the Iranian forces alongside with many Allied forces. This conflict has resulted in the deaths of 2,000 people. And negotiated by the Iran Premier Ahmad Karim, if I said it right, and diplomatic pressure on the Soviet Union by the United States, this would soon lead the Soviet Union to even withdraw from Iran, and the dissolution of separatist Azerbaijani and Kurdish states. And this would pretty much be the beginning of the Cold War in America and the Soviet Union rivalry. Now, I kind of discussed the Egyptian coup in 1952, so I don't know what to really say because I discussed this in part 1. So I'm going to do it again. The Egyptian Revolution of 1952, also known as the Egyptian 1952 coup, or the 23rd of July Revolution, was a period in profound political, economic, and social changes in Egypt. As on the 23rd of July 1952, the revolution began targeting of King Farouk in a coup led by the Free Officers Movement, led by Gamal Abdel Nasser, who pretty much became president of Egypt until his death in 1970. As this was part of, the decolonization of Asia and Africa, alongside the beginning of the Arab Cold War between many states in the Arab world that were, Arab monarchies and Arab republics. The Corfu incident. There was a Corfu incident. There's 2 of them. The first one happened in the 1920s, while this one happened in 1946, which I'm going to talk about. This is involving the Royal Navy ships in the Channel of Corfu, which took place in 1946, and is considered to be the early episodes of the Cold War. During the first incident, the Royal Navy ships came under fire by Albanian fortifications, and the second incident came from Royal Navy ships striking many mines. And the third had occurred when the Royal Navy had conducted mine clear operations in the Corfu Channel, but in Albanian territorial waters. And Albania had complained about them to the United Nations. And this had led to a series of incidents in the Corfu Channel, where the United Kingdom had brought the case against the People's Republic of Albania to the International Court of Justice. And the court, however, rendered a decision under which Albania had to pay around £800,000 to the United Kingdom, which is around £70 million right now. Britain in 1946 had broke off talks with Albania aimed at establishing diplomatic relations between the two countries, as diplomatic relations were only restored in 1991. Now, nobody died for Albania, but the United Kingdom had lost 44 people. 1948 Czechoslovakia coup d'etat. Now, this was a Soviet-backed coup that was pretty much, one of the starts of the Cold War, as it pretty much, implemented many communist governments across Eastern Europe, and pretty much started many satellite states being supported by the Soviet Union. After the successful performance of the 1946 parliamentary elections, party leader Kelmik Godwad became prime minister of a coalition government at the behest of President Evert Baines. and by summer of 1947, but Kemal Atatürk actually supported many pro-communist factions and would soon have a coup that would pretty much place him in power. As Czechoslovakia would soon be a Soviet satellite state and will pretty much stay communist all the way until revolutions of 1989. 1953 Iranian coup d'etat, known as in Iran as the Mordad 28th coup d'etat. This was the overthrow of Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh on 19 of August 1953, as it was orchestrated by the CIA and United Kingdom as a key motive to protect many British oil interests in Iran after Mossadegh had nationalized and refused to concede with many Western oil demands. As it was instigated by the United States under Operation Ajax and the United Kingdom under the name Operation Boot, as this had pretty much removed Mossadegh from power, as he was soon be replaced by Muhammad Reza Pahlavi, the Shah of Iran, which is Persian for king, to rule as a monarch. But he heavily relied on the United States' support to hold on power, and many people in Iran had called him, a puppet for the United States. And according to many CIA declassified documents and other records, some of the most feared gangsters and mobsters in Tehran were hired by the CIA to stage many pro-Shah riots to gain more support by the Shah. And the CIA even paid other men who were brought into Tehran in buses and trucks to take over the streets of the city. As between 200 and 300 people were killed because of this conflict. And Mossadegh was soon arrested and tried on conviction of treason by the Shah military court and was sentenced to 3 years in jail and then placed on house arrest for the remainder of his life. While his supporters would be imprisoned and some would even receive the death penalty. As the Shah would soon continue to rule Iran all the way until 1979 when the Iranian Revolution. And this is one of the incidents that had made Iran and America not really allies, because, Albania and Yugoslav border conflict from 1948 to 1955. The Albanian and Yugoslav border conflict was a period of armed confrontations between the armed forces of Albania and Yugoslavia between the years of 1948 and 1954. And this period has saw high tensions between Albania and Yugoslavia that stemmed from territorial disputes, ideological division between the Yugoslav leader Joseph Broz Tito and Albanian leader Enver Hoxha during the Cold War. At this border period has saw many border clashes. And this conflict is also incompatible with the continuous issues, including the status of Kosovo, which is significant Albanian population. Hoxha regime regarded Kosovo as a part of historical and ethnic territory, further fueling the tensions between the two nations. And the Sigmari Albanian secret police have played a secret role separatism in Kosovo, advocating for the idea for a greater Albania, and the Sigmari had actively supported the planners in exile, working to cultivate a support for independent Kosovo among Albanians in Yugoslavia. And it was reported that Hoxha had brought Albanian separatists into Yugoslavia to advance his aim supporting separatism in Kosovo and implementing greater Albania project. As this conflict would soon have ended with many peace talks in the early 1950s, as around 700 Albanian soldiers would be killed and 16 would be arrested, while 34 Yugoslav soldiers would be killed during this time. The Hungarian Revolutions of 1956. The Hungarian Revolutions of 1956, also known as the Hungarian Uprising, was an attempted countrywide revolution against the government of Hungary People's Republic and the policies caused by the government relations to the Soviet Union. This uprising had lasted for 15 days before being crushed by Soviet tanks and troops on the 7th of November 1946. Thousands of people would have been killed or wounded, and nearly a million Hungarians have fled the country. As the revolution began in Budapest, when university studies applied to the civil population had joined them at the Hungarian Parliament building and to protest the USSR geopolitical domination of Hungary. The Stalinist government of Matyarovsky, a delegation of students entered the building to broadcast their 16 demands for political and economic reforms in civil society, but they were detained. And when students protesters outside the radio building demanded the release of their delegation, as a group of police from the AVH State Protection Authority barely had shot several of the students. And consequently, Hungarians organized into revolutionary militias to fight against the AVH, as local Hungarian communist leaders and policemen would be captured and be executed, and political prisoners would be released and armed to realize their political, economic, and social demands. But soon the Soviet Union would soon have repressed the Hungarian Revolution on the 4th of November 1948 and fought many revolutionaries until Soviet victory on the 10th of November. And this had killed up to 2,500 Hungarians and 700 Soviet army soldiers. Sabah 1. This was a conflict in Zaire, Sabah Kanaka province, lasted from the 8th of March to the 26th of May 1977. And this conflict began when the Front for the Liberation of the Congo, a group of 2,000 Congolese soldiers who were veterans of the Congo crisis and the Angolan War of Independence and the Angolan Civil War, had crossed the border into Sabah from Angola and traveling east from the Zaire border with Angola. The rebels had released a small town near the mining town of Kowesi. Oh, I said it right. And Zairian President Motobo Sese Seko accused Angola, East Germany, and Cuba and the Soviet Union of sponsoring the rebels. Motivated by anti-communism and economic interests, both the Western Bloc and China sent assistance to his regime. And FAZ had terrorized the population of the province during and after the war, and bombings and other acts of violence had led to 50,000 to 70,000 refugees to flee into Angola or Zambia. And journalists were even prevented from entering the area, and several would be arrested. And Motobu had won public relations victory and ensured the continuing economic assistance from the governments, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and a group of private lenders led by Citibank. But this would not be the end, because there would be another conflict, known as the Sabah II, which had begun once again when many insurgents had clashed with the FAZ in 1978. And this conflict had ended the mutual end of support for other nations supporting the rebel groups, as around 400 rebels would be killed. North Yemen Civil War. The North Yemen Civil War, also known as in Yemen as the 26th Revolution, was a civil war fought in North Yemen from 1962 all the way to 1970 between the partisans of the Kingdom of Yemen and supporters of the Yemen Arab Republic. As this war began with a coup d'etat carried out in 1962 by revolutionary Republicans under the command of Abdullah al-Sahali, as he dethroned the newly crowned King Imam Muhammad al-Badr and declared Yemen as a republic. And under his presidency, the government had abolished slavery in Yemen, and the Imam had escaped to Saudi Arabia border, where he was rallying support from the northern Zaidi tribes to take the power. The conflict rapidly escalated to a full-scale civil war. As on the northern side, it would be Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and Israel. In the Soviet Union, as this would be a proxy war in the Arab Cold War between Saudi Arabia and Egypt, as Egypt will send 70,000 troops to assist Yemen. But during the Six-Day War, which started in 1967, when Egypt had pretty much was defeated, Nasser had soon withdrew all his troops from Yemen, and yeah. And clashes were soon continued until peace talks in 1970, when Saudi Arabia had soon recognized the public, and the ceasefire was soon came into effect. And this conflict is also called the Egyptian-Vietnam War, as around 200,000 people will be killed in this conflict. Operation Korea. This was a combined Soviet-Indonesian military operation which aimed to seize and annex Dutch overseas territories of New Guinea in 1961 to 1962. But after negotiations with the Netherlands had signed the New York Agreement with Indonesia, it was soon, it couldn't control of Western New Guinea to the United Nations. As there will be many landings and many paratroop landings in Korea. And it's estimated that around the Netherlands had lost 9 troops and Indonesia had lost 214 troops. The Guinea-Bissau War of Independence. Now I'm surprised this one is really down below, like at the bottom of this tier, because this is part of, the Portuguese Colonial War, which I discussed earlier. This was part of the Portuguese Colonial War, fought between 1963 to 1964. As it was fought between Portugal and the African Party for Independence of Ghana and Cape Verde. As an armed independence movement backed by Cuba, Soviet Union, Yugoslavia, and Brazil, this war is also referred to commonly as Portugal-Vietnam because it was protracted in guerrilla warfare, which was extremely high cost for men and material, which created a civil internal political in Portugal. As Portugal had lost up to 2,000 men, and the African Party for Independence of Ghana and Cape Verde will have lost 6,000 men, as around 5,000 civilians were being killed. Communist insurgency in Thailand. This was known as the People's War from leftist perspective, was guerrilla warfare lasting from the 1960s all the way into the 1980s, fought mainly between the Communist Party of Thailand and the government of Thailand. But it has soon begun to wind down in the 1980s following the declaration of amnesty. In 1983, the Communist Party of Thailand had abandoned the insurgency, ending the conflict. This was part of the Indochina Wars as well, and we even had many American forces in this conflict. And it's estimated around either 4,000 or around 6,000 people were killed in total in this war. The Hawk Rebellion. The Hawk Rebellion was a rebellion staged in the Philippines by former People's Anti-Japanese Army soldiers against the Philippine government. As it started out in 1946 after independence in the Philippines, and it ended in 1954, as this would be one of the earliest, incidents after, World War II of a communist rebellion in Asia. As around 9,000 communist rebels be killed and up to 1,000 Philippine army's soldiers will be killed. Insurgency in Aceh. Insurgency in Aceh, also known as the rebellion in Aceh by the Indonesian government, was a conflict fought between the Free Aceh movement between 1976 and 2005 with the goal of making the province of Aceh independent from Indonesia. And after the aftermath of the military offensive in 2003 and the 2004 Indian Ocean earthquake and tsunami have brought peace to the end of the insurgency, as over 15,000 people will be killed in this conflict. The First Sudanese Civil War, also known as the Anya Na Rebellion. This was a civil war fought between 1955 and 1972 between the northern part of Sudan and the southern part of Sudan, which determined reparations and more regional autonomy. As this war was divided into 4 major stages: as initial guerrilla warfare, creation of the Anya insurgency, political strife within the government, and establishment of the Southern Sudan Liberation Movement. As this war had pretty much started as a big divide of a predominantly Muslim, Arabic-speaking northern government and the Christian and Aramist majority southern regions of Sudan. As this war would soon have continued all the way to 1972, but it failed to despise the tensions addressed in many issues in southern Sudan, and this will soon start another conflict as the Second Sudan Civil War, which lasted from 1983 to 2005. It's estimated around 1 million people were killed during this conflict. And this would be the beginning of the ongoing Sudanese civil war conflicts, as there's still a civil war happening in Sudan, which is now a genocide happening in Sudan. 1971 Sudanese coup d'etat. This was a coup d'etat for a short-lived communist-backed coup led by Major Hashmi al-Hatta, if I said it right, one of the founding members of the Free Officers Organization that carried out a coup 2 years prior against the government president of Ghaffar Nimri. This coup took place on 19th of July 1971, topping the government of the Democratic Republic of Sudan, but failed to garner any support domestically or internationally. And after several days, there will be a counter coup launched by Nimri loyalists, freeing him and toppling out of the government. And following the coup, Nimri pushed by the defense minister to move his strengthened rules, and by the end of the year, ultimately authority had transferred from the multi-member Revolutionary Command Council to the presidency held by Nimri. Over the next several years, and the remaining members of the RCC would see their authority diminished. Gulf of Sidra incidents. Now, these was a series of incidents fought by Libya and the United States military, as there'd be multiple clashes in the Gulf of Sidra between Libya and the United States, but the United States would soon have, won this, multiple times. Back in 1981, they had shot down 2 Libyan aircraft. In 1986, where they had, carried out many airstrikes in Libya, killing 72 soldiers. And another in 1989, where they had shot down 2 Libyan aircraft. Naxal Bari Uprising. This was an armed peasant revolt in 1967 in the Naxal Bari block of the Sigali subdivision in the Bajing district in West Bengali, India. Hope I said it right. It was mainly led by tribals and radical communist leaders of the Bengali and further developed into a Communist Party of India in 1969. As this was an armed struggle had led to be a birth of Naxalism and beginning of Naxali Maya's insurgency, which rapidly spread from West Bengal to other states in India and continues to this day. As this uprising was pretty much, fought between the Indian police service and many of these communist groups, as one police officer had died and 11 rebels would be killed in this uprising. In China, the Communist Party of China would not even agree with the Communist Party of India and deteriorate many support of the uprising. And still to this day, there is still an insurgency of many left-wing extremist groups in India to this day. India intervention in the Sri Lankan Civil War. The Sri Lankan Civil War was fought in Sri Lanka from 1983 to 2003, beginning on 1983, July 23rd, as an insurgency against the government by the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Iman, also known as the Tamil Tigers, as it was fought to create an independent Tamil state in the northeast of the island. And India would soon deploy many troops as Indian peacekeeper force in Sri Lanka, intended to perform a peacekeeping role, as the role this had followed after the Indo-Sri Lankan Accord between India and Sri Lanka of 1987, which intended to end the Sri Lankan Civil War between separatists. As India was soon intervening in this war from 1987 all the way to 1990. But actually, India started, this war, supporting this war since the beginning, as provided many training and military support to 6 Sri Lankan Tamil military groups, namely the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Iman, Tamil Iman Liberation Organization, People Organization of Tamil Ilam, and the Ilam Revolutionary Organization of Students, and the Ilam People Revolutionary Liberation Front, and the Tamil Ilam Liberation Army. I hope I said it all right. I really hope I said them all right. But yeah, at first they supported many militant groups. As most of these groups, rise, especially the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Ilam, they were really attributed to the initial backing it received from India. It is believed that supporting different militant groups in Indian government hoped to keep Tamil independence movement divided and be able to pretty much control it. And during 1989, the Sri Lankan government and the LTTE had reached an agreement and ceased the combat. From May 1989, the Sri Lankan government has started to provide weapons to the LTT for securing the departure of other groups to pretty much leave. An official ceasefire was agreed between the Sri Lankan government and the LTT was signed on the 28th of June 1990. As over 1,000 Indian troops were killed in this war, while the LTTE had lost 5,000. But this war would still go on all the way up until 2009, as this war had caused the death toll of up to 100,000 deaths. Al-Wadia War. Now, this was a military conflict that broke out on the 27th of November 1969 between Saudi Arabia and the People's Republic of South Yemen after disputes of the towns of Wali Aida and Shahara on the border. As both South Yemen and Saudi Arabia had saw this territory as part of their own, and there's also rumors of oil and water disputes around the town, which pretty much aggravate the dispute. And the town was located in the continuous border of South Yemen and Saudi Arabia, and some 15 prior years have been the site of a border dispute between the Saudis and the British. And the Yemen-Saudi relations have been very tense, with the fallout of Saudi Arabia regarding left-wing government as very hostile, which was soon recuperated by Yemen, which supported the overthrow of the Gulf monarchies. And Saudi government went so far as to fund armed South Yemen descendants and encourage them to conduct raids across the border into South Yemen. And Yemen accused the Saudi government of planning further attacks in November 1969. As this war had pretty much started out after this, as the Saudis had built a road to Al-Wadia and garrisoned soldiers there, incorporated into the kingdom. And the Yemeni government claimed that the Saudis had occupied Al-Wadia and would soon start fighting. There have been many clashes between South Yemen and Saudi Arabia, and Iraq and Jordan had pretty much tried to end this conflict, and the Royal Saudi Air Force even made many aerial bombardments of many Yemeni positions, including having Pakistani pilots even support in this war as well. As Saudi forces have proceeded to take up defensive positions within Al-Wadia, and some abandoned South Yemen equipment was even seized, as the Saudis had claimed to occupy Al-Wadia by the 5th of December and took journeys to the town and pretty much had, won the war. As right after the conflict had ended, there will be many construction of military sites within the region to pretty much stop the more invasions, especially after the 1972 Tripoli Agreement, which under North and South Yemen agreed to unite due to Saudi's hostility to any merger. In March 1973, Saudi Arabia had claimed that the two South Yemen aircraft had attacked Al-Wadiya, although they had denied such incident, and claimed Saudi Arabia was searching for a pretext military intervention in South Yemen. And there was a brief warning of relations between the two countries in 1977, although this has soon had lapsed and were recalled by both countries. As around 35 South Yemen soldiers were killed, and 39 Saudis were killed in this war. Ethiopian-Somali border war. Now there are two border wars that happened, so I'm gonna cover both of them. The 1964 Ethiopian-Somali border war was known as the First Ogaden War, as it marked the first military conflict between the newly established Somali Republic and the Ethiopian Empire, lasting from February to April 1964. These border conflicts were preceded by rebellion in the Ogaden region during the mid-1963 that was waged by Somalis seeking self-determination for independent rule. And large-scale Ethiopian counterinsurgency operations have begun harshly military crackdowns on the population of the Ogaden carried out by the Emperor Haile Selassie government, and the rapid decline of Ethio-Somali relations leading to direct competition between both government armed forces. There have been many large and small-scale clashes between border police Ethiopian airstrikes that began in late 1964, escalated into a large-scale warfare in early 1964. And this conflict was highlighted in disparity in military strength between the larger and highly equipped Ethiopian military and the small Somali National Army, which had only formed during independence 4 years prior. As both countries were pretty much being in a state of emergency, and there were many airstrikes, and this would even be a proxy war as well, as Ethiopia would be supported by the United States, while Somalia would be supported by Egypt. And on March 30th, 1964, due to the meditation efforts of the Sudanese president, Somalia and Ethiopia had soon agreed to an armistice, which soon had pretty much end all hostilities on the 2nd of April 1964. As both countries would soon withdrew the troops from the border and ceased many propaganda. As estimated, around 2,000 people will be killed in this war. But this is the first conflict, as there'll be another conflict in the 80s. As this will intertwine in many conflicts that was happening in North Africa and Eastern Africa during this time, such as the Somali Rebellion, Eritrean War, Ethiopian Civil War, and yeah. This was another border war that happened in 1982, all the way up to 1983. Ethiopia had launched a scaled invasion of central Somalia backed by warplanes and armed units. And Ethiopia had deployed a 10,000-man force alongside thousands of Somalia Democratic Front rebels. And this was pretty much trying to aim to advance all the way to the Somali coastline and overthrow the regime. Despite the efforts, Ethiopian troops and guerrillas had soon failed to capture the key city of Galiko and Badame, as Somali army successfully repelled the main assault. However, this will soon go into a military stalemate around the border, as around almost 4,000 people will be killed in this conflict. Jebel Akhdar War. Now this was a war that was also referred to as the Oman War or the Jebel Akhdar Rebellion or the Green Mountain War. Was a war in Yemen that broke out in the 1950s as an effort by local Omanis in the interior region of Oman, led by their elected Imam Gabir al-Hanan, to protect the emirate of Oman for occupation plans of Syed bin Tamar, who was pretty much the Sultan of Muscat in Oman, backed by the British government, who were eager to gain access to the oil wells and interior lands of Oman. Sultan Syed had received direct financing to raise an armed force occupied many parts of Oman from Iraq Petroleum Company and other oil companies in the region. As the emirate was eventually supported by Arab states, and the war had lasted all the way until 1959, the British armed forces had decided to take direct interventions using air and ground attacks, which had won the war, and declarations were signed by the Sultans of Muscat to consult the British government of all important matters. As unequal trade treaties signed by two sides favoring the British interests in the secession of the Omani Kuwa Muwa Islands to the British. And vast control over many of government ministries, including defense and foreign affairs, were exerted by the British, rendered this area as a de facto British colony. The United Nations General Assembly adopted the Question of Oman Resolution in 1965, and in 1966, and again in 1967, and they called upon the British government to cease all actions against the locals and end British control over Oman. Even though this war lasted for 4 years, this was actually a small and unknown war, as over 500 people were killed in this war. The 1980 Surinamese coup d'etat. Also referred to as the Sergeant's coup, this was a military coup in Suriname which occurred on the 25th of February 1980 when a group of 18 sergeants of the Surinamese Armed Forces, led by Dincy Bottis, was it right, overthrew the government Prime Minister Hendrik Aaron with a violent coup d'etat. As marked the beginning of the military dictatorship that dominated the country all the way until 1991. As dictatorship had featured on the presence of even curfew, lack of freedom of press, a ban on political parties, restriction of freedom of assembly, and a high level of government corruption and some executions of political opponents. As there will be pretty much many murders and many massacres that have followed after this. In 1982, a group of 15 academics, journalists, lawyers, and union leaders and military officials who opposed to military rule will be snatched from their beds and brought to a military base where they've been tortured and executed. This will be known as the December Murderers. And in 1986, British soldiers had killed at least 39 citizens, mostly women and children, on the Maroon village of Moa. 1968 Peruvian coup d'etat. This was a coup d'etat that took place during the first presidency of Fernando Belade, if I said it right, as a result of political disputes becoming norms and serious arguments between President Belade and Congress, rising by a dominated APRA UNO, and even many political clashes between him and his own political party. As on October 3rd, 1968, there will be a coup d'etat that will be led by Juan Alvarado, if I said it right, who was, general of the coup. He had pretty much led an armed squadron of tanks that went towards the president's palace. As soon as the president would be woken up from his bed, dragged out of his bed in pajamas, and his militants had pretty much opted hey, get out, and he pretty much offered no resistance, and they just kicked him out. As soon as he would be forced into a jet and then exiled into Argentina, as he would spend the next years of Roscoe regimes in both Argentina and the United States as a professor. So yeah, he just pretty much stayed in Argentina as a professor. So yeah, it was a bloodless coup and nobody had died. Rwandan Revolution. This was also known as the Hutu Revolution or the Social Revolution or the Wind of Destruction. This was a period of ethnic violence in Rwanda that ranged from 1959 to 1961 between the Hutu and the Tutsi, two of the three ethnic groups in Rwanda. Now, for years, Rwanda had been ruled by a Tutsi monarchy since at least the 18th century, which enriched in Tutsi and anti-Hutu policies, as Germany and Belgium had successfully controlled Rwanda through the 20th century. And both of these countries have pretty much made these ethnic tensions even worse by pretty much saying both of these ethnic groups saying, oh, these are better, or this one is better, pretty much making more racism between these ethnic groups. After 1945, the Hutu counter elite developed, leading to deteriorations relations between the group. As the Tutsi leadership agitated for a speedy independence to cement their power, and the Hutu elite called for the transfer of power from the Tutsi to the Hutu, in a stance increasingly supported by the Catholic Church and colonial government. As the revolution began in 1959 with a series of riots and attacks on Tutsi homes following attack on a few Hutu sub-chiefs. As violence had quickly spread throughout the country, as the king and the Tutsi politicians attempted to counter back and seize power and orchestrated the Hutu and Belgians, but they were thwarted by Belgian Colonel Guy Lotjes, who was brought by the colonial governor. As Lotjes had re-established law and order, beginning a program to promote and protect the Hutu elite, as the Belgians then replaced many Tutsi chiefs and sub-chiefs with Hutu, coinciding with King Kikule to figurehead status, but soon he would later flee the country. And despite the continued anti-Tutsi violence, Belgium organized local elections in mid-1960s, as Hutu party gained near control of all communes and effectively ending the revolution. As Lotjes and Hutu leader had declared Rwanda autonomous republic in 1961, and soon the country would soon gain independence in 1962. The revolution had caused over 300,000 Tutsis to flee to neighboring countries where they lived as refugees. Also, the exiles agitated for immediate return to Rwanda, as they were split between those seeking negotiation and those wishing to overthrow the regime. As there were many armed groups who would launch many attacks into Rwanda. As the launch attack occurred in 1963, when the surprise attack approached Kigali, and the government fought back, defeating the rebels, killing thousands of the remaining Tutsi in Rwanda. But this here will pretty much lead up to Hutu extremism in the 1994 Rwanda genocide, which is one of the worst modern genocides in modern history, as up to 1 million people will be killed in this genocide. Protest Rebellion. This was a rebellion movement in Indonesia that was declared on the 2nd of March 1957 by civil and military leaders in eastern Indonesia. Initially, the center of the movement was in Makassar, which was at the time the capital of the province of Sulawesi, if I said it right. However, support for the movement in South Sulawesi had gradually disbanded, as forcing the headquarters to move to Mando. And on February 1958, Permesta joined forces with the revolutionary government of the Republic of Indonesia, based in Sumatra, declaring a revolutionary government 2 days later, following successful attacks on government forces with Indonesian central government. And the conflict swung to the east, where the Permesta rebels were based, and Mando was captured at the end of 1958. However, the Permesta rebels had continued their resistance, fighting guerrilla campaign against the TNI until the last remnants was surrendered and were given amnesty in 1961. And this conflict had killed up to 4,000 government soldiers and 2,000 rebels. The Aden Emergency. This was also known as the 14th October Revolution, or as the Wadfan Uprising. It was an armed rebellion led by the National Liberation Front and the Front for Liberation Occupied of South Yemen against British control in South Arabia. As partly inspired by Gamal Abdel Nasser pan-Arabian nationalism, it began on the 14th of October 1963 with the following of throwing a grenade at a gathering of British officials at the Aden airport. A state of emergency was soon declared in the British Crown colony of Aden. And this emergency pretty much escalated in 1967 and hasted the end of rule of the territory, which began in 1839. As this war had caused the death of 92 British soldiers, 17 federal troops would be killed in this conflict, and 382 rebels would be killed. But soon, Yemen would be soon split up, as this would pretty much create South Yemen and North Yemen. The Cimbriana. This was a series of clashes that referred to a series of clashes fought during World War II in Athens from December 3rd, 1944 all the way to January 1945. And this conflict was a combination of many tensions between many left-wing groups and parts of his military army. That was against the Kingdom of Greece and the United Kingdom. And this pretty much coincided with the Greek Civil War. And these clashes that ended with the defeat of many left-wing groups, leading to a disarmament in the Bakisa Agreement, which had marked the end of the ELAS. As the first defeat broke out the power of the EAM, together with the EAM, this had pretty much instigated the Red Terror, which would be followed by the period of the White Terror against many Greek left wing. As soon as this pretty much started the Greek Civil War in 1946, and this was pretty much the earliest conflicts of many, communist groups during at the end of World War II and the beginning of the Cold War, as up to 2,000 people will be killed in this conflict. Insurgency in the Baltic states. So this was an insurgency waged by the Baltic states and Latvian, Lithuanian, and Estonian partisans against the Soviet Union from 1944 to 1946, ultimately known as the Forest Brothers, or the Brothers of the Wood, or the Forest Frayers. These partisans have fought against invading Soviet forces during the occupation of the Baltic states during and after World War II. Similar insurgent groups resisted Soviet occupation in Bulgaria, Poland, Romania, and Ukraine. Soviet forces, consisting primarily of the Red Army, occupied the Baltic states in 1940, completing their occupation by 1941, after a period of German occupation during World War II. And Soviets assumed we occupied Lithuania from 1944 to 1945 as Soviet political repression intensified over the following years, as tens of thousands of partisans from the Baltic begins to use the countryside as a base for anti-Soviet insurgency. And according to many estimates, at least 50,000 partisans, 10,000 in Estonia, 2,000 in Latvia, and 3,000 in Lithuania, in addition to their supporters, were involved in insurgency. As partisans had continued to decay and armed struggle until 1956, the superiority of the Soviet security forces, largely in the form of secret agents, infiltrated many of these groups and had caused, them to pretty much, decline. As it's estimated around, on both sides, 50,000 people would be killed. Kazan Rebellion. This was an armed anti-state rebellion of peasants that occurred in May 1950 in the towns of Kazan and Velika Kasia in the Bosniak-Kajir region in Yugoslavia. As peasants revolted against the forced colonization and cleared farms set up by the Yugoslav government following the drought in 1949, after which they had been pushed due to inhabitants to meet their quotas, and the ringleaders was to be persecuted and some killed, including many civilians. This had caused the death of 32 people, and 700 people will be arrested. The Cold Wars. These was a series of competitions between the United Kingdom and West Germany and Iceland about fishing rights in the North Atlantic. Each of these disputes ended with Icelandic victory. As fishing boats from Britain had begun sailing the waters in search for catch since the 14th century, the agreements had struck in the 15th century started doing long, intimate disputes between two countries. As demand for seafood and constant competition for fish stock had grew rapidly in the 19th century, and modern disputes had begun in 1952 after Iceland had expanded its territorial waters from the 3rd to the 4th nautical miles. And the United Kingdom responded by banning many Icelandic ships from landing their fish in the British ports. In 1958, Iceland had still expanded its territorial waters to 12 nautical miles and banned foreign fishing from fleets. And Britain refused such a decision, which had sent to a competition. There would be 3 competitions over 20 years. The first one happened in 1958 to 1961. The second one happened in 1972, 1973, and the third one happened in 1975 to 1976. And British fishing boats would be escorted to fishing grounds by the Royal Navy, while Icelandic Coast Guard had attempted to chase them away, alongside even using long hawsers to cut nets from British fishing boats. And both sides had suffered damage from ramming attacks. Each of these competitions had pretty much concluded with an agreement for favor for Iceland, as Iceland had pretty much won all these conflicts, and even made threats that it would leave NATO, which NATO did not want to have a member to leave. But soon, in 1976, Britain would soon finally accept the establishment of the 12 nautical mile exclusive zone around the shores, where other nation fishing fleets needed Iceland's permission. The agreement was brought to end more than 500 years of unrestricted British fishing in these waters. And as a result, many British fishing communities would be devastated, and thousands had lost their jobs. And UK had declared a similar 200 nautical mile zone around its own waters. And since 1982, a 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone had been international standard for under the United Nations Convention of Law of the Sea. And there was only one confirmed death during the Cold Wars, which is an Icelandic engineer who was accidentally killed in 1973 while repairing a damage to an Icelandic patrol boat after collision with a British frigate. So yeah, there was no major battles doing this. It was just a standoff. Very crazy. The South Yemeni crisis, also referred to as South Yemen Civil War. Now, this pretty much happened after a failed coup d'etat in 1986, which took place in January 13th, 1986 in South Yemen. And a civil war had developed as a result of ideological differences between later tribal tensions between the two factions in the ruling Yemeni Socialist Party, and it has centered on Abdul Fattah Ismaili faction and Al Nasir Muhammad faction. for independence of, leadership for South Yemen. The conflict escalated into a costly civil war that had lasted for 11 days and resulted for thousands of deaths of casualties. Additionally, the conflict resulted in the demise of much of South Yemen socialist parties. Most experienced social leadership as soon collapsed. And this had contributed to a weaker government, and soon South Yemen was soon unified with North Yemen in 1990 to pretty much no longer be weak. As this has caused the death of up to 6,000 people. Insurgency in Laos. Now, this is part of the Third Indochina War, which I discovered in part 1. So this was a low-level intensity conflict between the Laotian government on one side of the foreign members of the secret army, Laotian royalists who supported the royal government of Laos, and rebels from Hmong, other Laotian ethnic minorities. These groups have faced reprisals from the Laos People Army and Vietnamese People Army for the support for United States-led anti-communist military campaigns in Laos during the Laotian Civil War, which the insurgency on itself had pretty much started when North Vietnam invaded Laos and supported the Communist Pathet Lao. The Vietnamese communists continued to support the Pathet Lao after the end of the Laotian Civil War and establishment of the Lao People's Democratic Republic. As at least 100 Hmong civilians were killed doing this, which resulted in the Hmong genocide. While depleted, the remnants of the early 1980s and 1990s royal insurgency has been kept alive, occasionally an active guerrilla force of several thousand, so successors can continue that force. But in June 2007, Wang Pao, who was arrested in the United States for alleged plot to overthrow the Laotian Communist government, his arrest had led to the end of many various attempts to overthrow the Laotian government by the Hmong people, by the loyalists and right-wing rebellions. And this is still ongoing a bit. Even though it had ended with the Laos People's Democratic Republic, had pretty much made a crackdown on many Laotian rebels. Romanian anti-communist resistance movement. This had began in 1944 as Soviet troops entered Romania, as it active from the late 1940s to the mid-1950s, which isolated individual fighters remaining at a large until the early 1960s, when army resistance was first and most structured form of resistance against many communist forces in Romania, which had regarded the fighters as bandits, as it was not until the overthrow of Nicolae Ceausescu in late 1989 that details was called about the anti-communist resistance were made public. And then that went on to the end of World War II, all the way to the mid-Cold War, but it will soon end when Romanian government had pretty much won and many of these insurgencies had pretty much been suppressed. And it's really hard to know the casualties of this conflict, as for Romania, it's estimated around, the death toll is really unlikely, unknown. But most people estimate it's either 20 or 200 Romanian soldiers were killed in this conflict, while 2,000 rebels be killed, and many of them will be executed. Egyptian-Libyan War. Also known as the 4-Day War, this was a short border war fought between Libya and Egypt that lasted from the 21st of July to the 24th of July in 1977. And this conflict has stemmed from a deterioration in relations that occurred with the two states after the Egyptian president Anwar Sadat have rebuffed the Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi entries to unify their countries and have pursued a peace settlement with Israel after the Yom Kippur War. As Libya did not really agree with, the Egyptian ceasefire and peace agreement with Israel, and soon after this, Libya began sponsoring dissidents and assassination plots to undermine Sadat. And Egypt had responded to kind to weaken Gaddafi. As in early 1976, Gaddafi had dispatched troops to the Egyptian frontier when they began clashing with border guards. And Sadat responded by moving many troops to the area, while Egyptian general staff had drew his plans for invasion to pretty much get rid of Gaddafi. There been many clashes in July 1977 after a Libyan tank had weighted down the town of Salom, and the Egyptian forces ambushed it and pretty much launched a counterattack, conducting airstrikes against Gamal Abdel Nasser air base and sending a mechanized force into Libyan territory. As over the next 2 days, heavy artillery fire was exchanged across the border, our Egyptian jets and commando raids had raided many areas in Libya. And the Egyptians had launched a larger raid against Nasser air base and had struck Libyan supply depots under significant pressure from the United States, led to end the war in the ceasefire. as up to 500 people were killed in this war in total. Sheet of vote. Now, this was a failed coup d'etat that was an uprising against the Ba'athist government in Iraq in July 1963. As the vote was parted by the partisans of the Iraqi Communist Party, in conjunction with many Punchless military officers, and the vote had failed to spread outside Baghdad. It was crushed by many Ba'athist government forces. This literally lasted for one day, and this was a coup attempt, and only one person had died. So yeah. The Buzin Uprising of 1953. This was an uprising that occurred when workers of the Czechoslovakian city of Buzin had revolted in violent protests for 3 days, from 31st of May to June 2nd, against the currency reforms of the state party and the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia. As the main people have even went on strike, this had caused many state officials to not like this, as the government had sent 2 police battalions of 8,000 men and an army unit of over 2,000 men and 80 tanks to stop this. And during the street fights, over 200 rebels were injured, and during the afternoon of June 2nd, the insurgents had barricaded themselves in factories and soon gave up, as over 2,000 people would be taken prisoner. And there was other strikes that happened in other cities, but they weren't really violent, and they ended in a week. And they, pretty much lost the strike. The Brasov Rebellion. The Brasov Rebellion was a revolt against Nicolae Ceausescu's economic policies in communist Romania, which had erupted the day after the 1987 election, and would be the prelude into the Romanian Revolution. As beginning in late 1986, the seeds of the Romanian Revolution were sown, as workers throughout the Soviet bloc country had mobilized in protest of communist leader Nicolae Ceausescu's economic policies. Labor uprising has sprouted in major industrial cities, as there be many strikes of many workers across Romania. As in the early morning of the 15th of November, on local election days, 20,000 workers had walked off the job and marched toward the communist headquarters of the city, as many of, the workers have pretty much, touted many slogans like "Downward Communism" and chanted anthems of the 1848 revolution, "Down with the dictatorship, we want bread." But it would soon be suppressed by Department of State Security and military forces have surrounded the city and disbanded the revolt by force. And though nobody was killed, but 300 protesters will be arrested and many will be injured. As this had pretty much started out into the Romanian Revolution, as soon later on, 1989, Ceausescu and his wife will be soon executed. Corsican conflict. The Corsican conflict is an armed political conflict on the island of Corsica, which had begun in 1976 between the government of France and the Corsican nationalist militant groups, mainly the National Liberation Front of Corsica, and the factions of the group beginning in 1970s, as the Corsican conflict had peaked in the 1980s before Corsican national groups and the French government had reached a truce in 2016. As this would be a long conflict, and it's still ongoing as the 2022 Corsica unrest. As this conflict was spread against many places in France, Corsica, and Italy as well, as up to 100 people were killed in this conflict. 1988 Maldives coup d'etat. Now, this was a coup d'etat attempt by a group of Sri Lankans and Maldivians led by businessman Abdullah Latifi and assisted by armed mercenaries of Tamil Secessionist Organization for Sri Lanka and the People Liberation Organization of Tamil Eelam to overthrow the government in the island of the Republic of Maldives. And this was thwarted by Indian assistance in Operation Cactus. And this is part of the Indian intervention of the Sri Lankan Civil War. And this was a coup attempt against Mahmoud Abdul Gayoom presidency, as about 80 armed mercenaries had landed in the capital Mal before dawn aboard speedboats and from a hijacked Sri Lankan freighter. Disguised as visitors, and a similar had already infiltrated the city earlier. The mercenaries had gained control of the capital, including major government buildings, airports, and ports, and television and radio stations, as the mercenaries had marched towards the presidential palace, where President Gayoom was residing with his family. But he would be escorted by Moldovan national security advisors to Defense Minister home before they had took his house. And the mercenaries had seized the presidential palace and managed to take to the Moldovan education minister as hostages. And President Gayom had requested military intervention from Sri Lanka and Pakistan, but they both denied any help. In citing a lack of military capabilities, the president has soon requested Singapore intervention, but Singapore had declined, and citing the same reasons. After that, he contacted the United States, but was told that it would take 2 to 3 days to reach them, as which he, didn't really want that. So soon, he contacted the United Kingdom, which the United Kingdom had told them, we don't want to do this. We're too busy doing something right now, so ask India. So soon, he asked India for assistance, and India quickly accepted it. As soon as started Operation Cactus, which was the Indian Armed Forces operation that had pretty much sent 500 Indian paratroopers alongside with the Maldivian National Defense Force to pretty much, stop this coup. And this here will be, pretty much, a very, very fast operation, as majority of the mercenaries were either, killed and some were captured. And India has received international praise for the operation, as United States President Ronald Reagan has expressed his appreciation for India action, calling it a valuable contribution to regional stability. And Margaret Thatcher reportedly commented, "Thank God for India." The 1964 Brazilian coup d'etat. This was a military overthrow of Brazilian President, hope I said it right, Jair Coudart, from March 31st to April 1st, 1964, ending the Fourth Brazilian Republic and initiating a Brazilian dictatorship, as the coup took the form of a military rebellion and declaration of vacancy in the presidency by National Congress on April 2nd, and the formation of a military junta. As this coup would be backed by the United States, as the United States had pretty much saw him colliding with communists, and the American government has soon allied with opposition forces in their efforts supporting the coup, as he had, was ousted by the government and would be sent to Uruguay seeking political asylum. And this here would soon lead into another conflict in Brazil, as this had caused the death of 7 civilians who were pro-government. As this conflict was soon turned into Uruguay guerrilla war, which was an armed movement in Brazil against its military government active between 1974 in Uruguay River Basin, as it was founded by militants of the Communist Party of Brazil, and then the Maoist version of it, the Brazilian Communist Party, which aimed at establishing a rule stronghold from hence to wage a people's war against the Brazilian military dictatorship, which had been in power since 1964 coup d'etat, as its projected activities was based on a successful experience led by the 26th July movement and the Cuban Revolutionary, and by the Chinese Communist Party during the Chinese Civil War. And this would be another small conflict, and they would even be supported by Albania, and some people even call this Brazil's Vietnam War. And there will be many military operations during this war, such as Operation Parrot, which is a conventional use of large regular military units in the first campaign against many guerrillas, which ended in the departure of troops due to, efficiency of such approach. Operation Anaconda from 1973 was aware of their efficiency and had used conventional war models, methods, and resources against rural guerrilla warfare, fearing that the Uruguay could become, in the long run, a controlled or currently area used by the guerrillas in other regions in the globe. And the military had decided to change their mode of operation. And Operation Anaconda was a military intelligence operation which has used the same methods of guerrilla warfare, as for example, the gradual infiltration among the civilian population of specially trained, support, and monitor agents, in Operation Majora and Operation Cleansing, which was 2 operations that pretty much saw the end of this conflict, that pretty much wiped out majority of the guerrilla forces, as majority of the guerrillas would either be up to 90 dead or missing. And it's really unknown to see the casualties for the Brazilian military side, because it's not really stated. Mosul Uprising. This was a typical coup d'etat by Arab nationalists in Mosul, who wished to depose the Iraqi Prime Minister al-Karim Qasim, if I said it right, and install an Arab national government, who would soon try to join with the United Arab Republic, which was part of which was Syria and Egypt during this time, but it was a failure, and law and order had broken down in Mosul, which in witness had several days of street battles between various groups of trying to control. But soon the coup would fail, and this would pretty much make increased power to Iraqi communists, alongside Iraqi Baathists would soon gain power, as 2,000 people would be killed doing this. Pause on 1956 protests. Now, these was a series of protests in the Internal Security Corps under command of Polish Soviet General Stanislaw Pawlowski were ordered to suppress the demonstrations, and doing this, they had pretty much fired at protesting civilians. And death toll is estimated around to be 50 to over 100 people, including a 13-year-old boy, as these protests would be soon suppressed in only 2 days. 1977, Shiskel's coup d'etat. This was a coup that had occurred in the East African and Indian Ocean country of Seychelles on the 4th of June 1977, as between 60 to 200 supporters of the Seychelles People United Party, who had been training in Tanzania, overthrew President Sir James Macham of Seychelles Democratic Party while he was attending the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in London. As insurgents had took control of strategic points in the main island of Mahé, where capital of Victoria is located, and the central police station was seized virtually without a shot being fired. After there was exchange of fire at Mount Fleur police station, where the arsenal was kept, and a policeman and one of the insurgents were killed in the fighting. As soon, the plotters had arrested 6 British Armed Forces officers who had been advising in the police force. And Seychelles as soon gained independence from the United Kingdom. The officers and their families, as well as the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Aidan O'Brien Crean, a judge from Ireland, on loans as the government was soon fly to Europe. And this coup was very short, and it was very successful. And there were 2 deaths, well, actually 2 deaths in total, as the SDP-led government had lost 1, and the insurgents had lost 1 as well. East German uprising of 1953. These was uprisings that had occurred over 2 days in the German Democratic Republic, aka East Germany, from the 16th of June to the 17th of June 1953. It began with a strike action by construction workers in East Berlin on the 16th of June as work quotas during the Sovietization process in East Germany. As demonstrations in East Berlin had turned into widespread uprising against the entire government and ruling Socialist Party the next day, and evolving into up to 1 million people about in 700 localities across the country as protests against declining living standards and unpopular Sovietization policies that led to a wave of strikes and protests that were not easily brought under control and threatened to overthrow the East German government. And the uprising in East Berlin was violently suppressed by tanks of the Soviet forces in Germany. And demonstrations continued out in over 500 towns and villages for several more days before eventually dying out, as up to 100 people will be killed. 1970s Operation in Balochistan. The 1970s Operation in Balochistan, also known as the Fourth Balochistan Conflict, was a 4-year military conflict in Balochistan, the largest provinces of Pakistan, between the Pakistan Army and the Baloch separatists and tribesmen that lasted from 1973 all the way to 1977. As conflict had began in 1973, shortly after the then Pakistan President Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, hope I said it right again, dismissed the elected provincial government of Balochistan on the pretext that arms had been discovered in the Iraqi embassy. And obviously for Baloch rebels, and in using protests against the dismissal of the duly elected government, had also led calls for Baloch to be secessed, met by Bhutto ordering Pakistan army into the province. Akbar Khan Bucky had served as provincial governor during the early stages of the conflict, as the operation itself was led by General Tiki Khan against an unknown number of militants quartered by their Baloch Sardars or tribal chiefs, most notably Kar Bashkash Mari and Atullah Mangal. And Iran having provided military support during the operation before the revolution. Fighting was intermittent throughout the conflict and climaxing in 1974 with the drawn-out battles as the Bhutto regime would soon be overthrown by General Zia Haq on the 5th of July 1977, which is the Operation Independence. Martial law was soon be imposed, and general amnesty was soon declared by military governor Ramadou Khan, and military action had ended on 1977 and replaced by development educational policies to pretty much consolidate the province, as up to 3,000 Pakistani soldiers would be killed, and up to 5,000 separatists would be killed in this war, and 16,000 civilians would be killed. Somaliland War of Independence. This was a rebellion waged by the Somali national movement against the ruling military junta in Somalia, led by General Syed Barre. Lasting from its founding on April 6, 1981, it ended on the 18th of May, 1991, when the SNM had declared what was known as Somalia independent as the Republic of Somaliland. As the company had served in the main theater of a larger Somali rebellion, which I discussed earlier, that started in 1938, as the company was repurposed to the harsh policies enacted by the Barre regime against the main clan family in Somaliland, the Isaac, hope I said it right, including a declaration of economic warfare on a clan family, as these harsh policies would soon be put shortly after the conclusion of the disastrous war in 1978. As a direct response to the harsh policies enacted by the Barre regime against the Isaac people, in April 1981, a group of Isaac businessmen, students, and former civil servants and former politicians have founded the Somali National Movement in London. From February 1982, Isaac army officers and fighters have started moving into Ethiopia, where they have formed a nucleus who will become the armed wing of the SNM. Throughout the early to mid-90s, the SNM had launched a guerrilla war against the Barre regime through incursions and hit and run operations on army positions within Isaac territories, especially into Ukri-Gabib and two godly reasons. After the conclusion of a peace deal between Somalia military junta and Ethiopia, the SNM had launched a major offensive in late May 1980, overrunning the cities. And during the ongoing conflict, the Somali government had had a genocidal campaign against the Isaac people that took place between May 1988 and March 1989, with specific aims of handling the Isaac problem. As Barre ordered the shelling an aerial bombardment of major cities in the northwest and systematic destruction of Isaac dwellers, settlement, and water points, and even targeting many civilian members. And by 1980, the Barre regime had lost large points of control of the northern regions, and by its collapse in 1991, the SNM succeeded in taking full control of northwest Somalia, after which the organization has soon opted for cessation of hostilities and reorganization with the non-Isaac communities, culminating in the Grand Conference of Northern Clans in Barrio between April 27th and May 18th, 1991. That soon had the formation of the Republic of Somaliland, and up to 200,000 people would have been killed. Sudanese Interior War. This was a civil war that fought in eastern Sudanese between 1986 and 1992. As conflict had primarily involved in the jungle commandos and rebel groups, which were largely Samaraka Maroon fighters, led by former soldier Ronnie Boswick and the Sudanese National Army, commanded by then Army Chief and de facto head of the state, Dacey Botois, if I said it right. As this war began as a personal feud between Dacey and Ronnie Boswick, a Maroon who had formerly served into Botois' bodyguard over time, and the conflict had evolved into a broader political and ethnic struggle, as Boswick had demanded democratic reform and civil rights and economic development for a country marginalized by Maroon population. As the armed conflict had officially began in the 22nd of July 1986 in the town of Stoffersicker, and when 12 soldiers had stationed at a checkpoint, they were captured in pre-dawn at the same night. Coordinated attacks would be carried out by the Sudanese army barracks in Albania, resulting in a 3-hour gunfight that had left one soldier and 2 civilians injured. As the war would soon go on, and there would be many ceasefire agreements, but this never really ended until March 19, 1991, when peace negotiations had soon resumed. The government had offered integration of the jungle commando members into the national army and employment for opportunities in forestry and gold prospecting in exchange for full disarmament. As soon in August 8, 1992, a peace treaty was signed by residents of the National Army and the jungle commandos in the Tugiana Amazonas. As this here was another conflict, there'd be many war crimes. As this war had led up to over 300 people being killed. The Thai-Lao Border War. This was also known as the Battle of Ban Womako, if I said it right again, was a short confrontation between the Thai and Laotian forces as it involved a dispute over a map made by French surveyors in 1906 to mark the borders between Siam and French Indochina in the southern Long Prang Range, as ownership of the village on the border of Pesenelak province and other border villages. As this here would soon lead to many shooting incidents and many skirmishes, as soon this would be, well, led to a very status quo that is still disputed a bit to this day, as up to 100 people will be killed. Telangana Rebellion. This year was a rebellion, was a communist-led insurrection of peasants in the princely state of Hyderabad in the region of Telangana that escalated out of the allegations of 1944 to 1946. As this had went on from 1946 all the way to 1951. As Hyderabad was a feudal monarchy, most of the land was concentrated in the hands of landed aristocrats, or as Dorwas in Telangana. As feudal exploitation in the region was more severe compared to the other areas of India, as the Dorwas had, complete power over the peasants and could pretty much subject them to agricultural slavery. The conditions had worsened during the 1930s during the Great Depression and the transition towards commercial crops. In the 1940s, peasants started turning towards communism as organized themselves through the Indra Mahasabha, hope I said it right, and began a rights movement. Catalyzed by a food crisis that was affected the region following the end of World War II, the movement had soon escalated into a rebellion after the administration and the Dorwas attempt to suppress it. As the revolt had began on the 4th of July 1946, when a local peasant leader was killed in the village of Kandave by the agents of Dora. And beginning in the districts of Nagadona and Wagal, hope I said it right, the rebellion had evolved into a revolution across the region. In response to contributed repression by Mir Osam Ali Khan Asavajar, hope I said it right, and then later Kazim Razvi, the Hyderabad state focused in police combined with the paramilitary Raskars were unable to suppress it and soon be routed while the rebel forces went on to a successful guerrilla offense. As the rebels had established a parallel system of government composed of Gramrans, village communes, and that caused a social revolution where caste and gender distinction were reduced, women workforce participation, including the armed squads, had soon increased, and the conditions of peasants steadily improved. And the rebellion had soon ended with the military administration set up by the Nehru government unexpectedly launched an attack on the communes immediately following the annexation of Hyderabad to fulfill insurance given by VP Menon to the American embassy that communists would soon be eradicated, leading to the eventual call for rebels to lay down arms issued by the Communist Party of India on October 25th, 1951. As this was one of the first instances of the Cold War, with communism soon spreading to many parts in South Asia, as up to 4,000 people were being killed in this conflict. The Sand War. Now this was a conflict that was fought between Algeria and Morocco, fought from September 25th to October 30th, 1963, as it was a form of peace treaty, but it was not signed all the way until 1964. As it resulted largely from the Moroccan government claiming the portions of Algeria, Tindorf, and Bikar provinces. The Sand War led to the heightened tensions between the two countries for several decades. As full-blown competition began on September 25th, 1963, once Moroccan forces occupied the border towns of Hassa, Beda, and Tijbo, if I said it right, beginning a battle with Algerian forces for control over other towns. In the north, Algeria opened a front near Ich, if I said it right, while Morocco had launched an offensive towards Tindorf in the south, and Cuban troops had even arrived in Algeria to prepare for an offensive into eastern Morocco, prompting Morocco to prepare for a second offensive. However, both attacks would be suspended and a ceasefire was initially declared on 30th October. As the ceasefire had marked the first multinational peacekeeping mission conducted by the Organization of African Unity, and the foreign peace treaty would be soon signed on the 20th of February 1964. As this is very hard to find casualties, as up to 39 Moroccan soldiers have been killed in this conflict, while some say 200 have been killed, and for Algeria and Egypt and Cuban sides, either 60 or up to 300 soldiers have been killed. The War in Vietnam, or the War in Southern Vietnam from 1945-1946. This would be a post-World War II armed conflict involving largely Indian and French task force from the Southern Expeditionary Army Group versus the Vietnamese independence movements, which included the Stalinist Front Viet Minh and the Trotskyists and Nationalists for control of the southern half of the country after unconditional Japanese surrender, starting right after the end of World War II. and the British had begun facilitating the return of the French to the half of Indochina of the 16th parallel. Now, most people know about the other Vietnam Wars, but this here will be the beginning of the whole Indochina conflict. As soon this would pretty much lead to France and Britain pretty much invade southern Vietnam to pretty much stop this rebellion. As soon the French colonial empire would soon take control of Indochina, but this would soon lead to other rebellions, as this would probably be the start of the first Indochina War, and would soon be the start of the entire Vietnam conflict that we know to this day. And this only lasted for 6 months. But as up to 2,000 people were killed in this war, and it's very hard to know the casualties because most of these records have not been really well tracked or still kept up. So making this war very, very unknown. Oh, hey there, sorry for interrupting one last time. So this is before we end the video, I'm gonna add 2 more conflicts that I want to add up here that is sort of related to the Cold War. So this is gonna be like a little bonus tier-ish. So yeah, these are gonna be 2 conflicts that I wanted to add. So yeah, let's do it. Okay, sorry, I'm gonna add 1 more and then we're done. Okay. Operation Eagle Claw. So Operation Eagle Claw was a failed United States Department of Defense attempt to rescue the 53 embassy staff held captive by the revolutionary Iran during the Iran Revolution and part of the Iran hostage crisis. And this happened in 1980 as ordered by U.S. President Jimmy Carter as the staff was seized at the embassy in Tehran. And this year was one of the first Delta Force failures in military history, as 8 helicopters were sent to the first danger area called Desert 1, but only 5 had arrived in operation condition, because the others were caught in a sandstorm and had soon crashed. And the operation was totally a failure, as President Carter had pretty much aborted the mission. As United States forces had prepared to withdraw from Desert 1, one of the remaining helicopters had crashed into a transport aircraft that contained both servicemen and jet fuel, resulting in a fire that destroyed both aircraft and had killed 8 servicemen. In the context of the Iran Revolution, Iran's new leader, Ayatollah Khomeini, had stated the mission had been stopped by the act of God. As this will even upset Iran too, as none of the hostages would be freed doing this, and soon they'd be moved to another area away from Tehran. But soon later on, during the Ronald Reagan inauguration, hostages will soon be released. The Iranian embassy siege in London, aka Operation Nimrod, was a SAS anti-terrorist unit that pretty much stopped Iranian embassy siege in London and South Kensington. The gunmen, Iranian Arabs campaigning for the sovereignty of Khuzestan province of Iran, had took 26 people hostage, including embassy staff, several visitors, and police officers who'd been guarding the embassy, and demanded the release of prisoners in Khuzestan and their own safe passage out of the United Kingdom. And the British government quickly decided that a safe passage would not be granted, and a siege ensued. And police negotiators had secured the release of 5 hostages in exchange for minor concessions, such as broadcasting the hostage takers' demands on British television, making it one of the first instance of SAS forces being seen in live television. But on the 6th day of the siege, the government were increasingly frustrated by the lack of progress meeting their demands, and that evening they had killed a hostage and threw his body out of the embassy, as the British Special Air Service, SAS, had initiated Operation Nimrod to rescue the remaining hostages by pretty much going through the roof and forcing entry for windows. By doing the 17-minute raid, yes, it happened in 17 minutes, they rescued all but one of the remaining hostages and had killed 5 of the 6 hostage takers, as one of them would soon be trying to hide after the siege had ended, and he'd be caught and he'd be sent to prison. This operation had sent the SAS to the public for the first time and had boosted the reputation of Margaret Thatcher government, and the SAS was soon overwhelmed by a number of applications it received, because many people really tried to join the SAS. The Troubles. Now, there were an ethno-nationalist conflict in Northern Ireland that lasted around for 30 years, from the late 1960s to 1998. Also known as the Northern Ireland conflict, it had begun in the late 1960s, as it usually demand to end it with the Good Friday Agreement of 1998. Although the Troubles mostly took place in Northern Ireland, but violence has soon spilled over in parts of the Republic of Ireland, England, and even in mainland Europe. Sometimes called the asymmetric or irregular war or the low-intensity conflict, the Troubles were a political and nationalist struggle fueled by historical events, with strong ethnic and sectarian division fought over the status of Northern Ireland, as Unionists and Loyalists, who historical reasons were mostly Ulster Protestants, wanted Northern Ireland to remain within the United Kingdom, Our Irish nationalists and Republicans, who were mostly Irish Catholics, wanted Northern Ireland to leave the United Kingdom and join in United Ireland. And despite the division between Protestants and Catholics, it was not primarily a religious war. And the government had begun doing a campaign by the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association to end discrimination against Catholics, nationalists, minority, by the Protestant Unionist government and local authorities. The government attempted to suppress the protests. The police, the Royal Ulster Constabulary, were overwhelmingly Protestant and known for their sectarianism and police brutality, as the campaign was widely oppressed by Ulster Royalists who believed that it was a front for the Republican and political activity. Increasing tensions would lead to August 1969 riots and deployment of British troops. In what became the British longest operation, peace walls were built in some areas to keep the communities apart. While some Catholics initially welcomed the British Army as more neutral force than the RUC, but soon came to see it as hostile and biased, particularly after Bloody Sunday in 1972. And British soldiers had shot 26 unarmed civilians during protests in the Bogside area of Derry, as 14 were killed doing this. And there were many people who had supported in the Troubles, which was the Republican military such as Provisional Irish Republican Army and the Irish National Liberation Army, loyalist paramilitaries such as the UVF and the UDA, alongside many British soldiers. As the Republicans had carried out a guerrilla campaign against British forces, as well as bombing campaigns against infrastructural, commercial, and political targets, our loyalists attacked Republicans, nationalists, and the wider Catholic community in what they would describe as retaliation. At times, there were bouts of circulating tit-for-tat violence, as well as feuds within paramilitary groups. The British security forces undertook policing and counterinsurgency campaigns, primarily against Republicans, and there were incidents of collision between the British state forces and loyalist paramilitaries. The Troubles also involved in numerous riots, mass protests, and acts of civil disobedience, and led to increased segregation and creation of temporary no-go areas, as more than 3,000 people were killed in the conflict, and the majority of them were civilians. And there it is, everybody. Wow. The entire Cold War Iceberg conflict explained. This was really fun to make. Wow. I never thought I would actually be able to finish this because I had to make 2 videos of it. And I'm really glad I finished this iceberg. And I'm really glad I got to talk about this. Mainly because I love the Cold War and I love history. And not many people know about, how all these conflicts actually pretty much affected many countries, actually the whole world in the long run. So yeah, that's all I gotta say. And this was a really long video and I'm really, really tired right now. So yeah, I'm gonna have to take a long break after this. So yeah, war is bad, by the way. War is really bad, but I'm glad I got this information out to y'all because history is really cool. So yeah, so shout out to Hanada28 who made this iceberg. Awesome guy. Shout him out. He's cool. And that's all I gotta say. Until I see you guys again, stay safe out there. Don't do drugs. Don't hurt people. Don't be evil. Hope you have a great day or night or evening. And yeah, stay hydrated, y'all. And until I see you again, peace.
Mason, it is over. We won.
For now.